The vote passed at 14:22 station time. I remember because I was watching the clock. I wasn't supposed to be watching the clock. I was supposed to be watching the delegates, taking notes, doing the quiet, invisible work that translators do at a place like the Concord. But I'd stopped taking notes about 20 minutes before, when I realized what they were actually about to do, and after that, I just watched the clock and waited for the thing I knew was coming to arrive. At 14:22, it arrived. The speaker of the Concord, a tall, silver-scaled Ithier with a voice like wind through a canyon, raised the ceremonial rod, and the great chamber went quiet, and she read out the result. The motion carries. Human pattern weapons are hereby declared unlawful within all territories of the Concord of Star Nations. All such weapons are to be surrendered, sealed, or destroyed within 30 standard days. Humanity's provisional membership is suspended pending compliance. And the chamber erupted, not in anger, in applause. 40-odd species, thousands of delegates, all of them on their feet, making whatever sound their bodies made to signal triumph, clicks and hoots, and that strange harmonic droning the Ithier do, celebrating that they'd finally done it, finally solved the human problem, finally made the scary new species put down its scary primitive weapons and behave. I sat in the translator's booth, high up on the wall of that chamber, and I watched 40 species celebrate, and I felt something cold settle into my stomach, because I was the only human in the room, and I knew something they didn't. My name is Dara Okonkwo. I was 34 years old, a contract translator attached to the Human Provisional Delegation, and I want to tell you what happened in the 11 hours after that vote, because the histories get it wrong. The histories make it sound clean, make it sound like strategy, like some grand human plan. It wasn't a plan. I was there. I watched it happen in real time from the inside, and it wasn't a plan at all. It was just the truth arriving, late and all at once, the way the truth usually does. Let me start from the beginning. Or at least, from where the beginning was for me. I should tell you how I ended up there in the first place, because it explains a lot about why I saw what I saw. I wasn't a diplomat. I wasn't military. I wasn't anybody important. I was a translator, a good one, but that's a craft, not a calling, and I'd fallen into it more or less by accident. I grew up on a human border world, one of those places where a dozen species trade routes crossed, and you learned 3 languages before you learned to read your own. Kids from places like that either leave and never look back, or they turn that accidental fluency into a living. I turned it into a living. By 30, I was a contract translator, going where the work was, and the work that year was at the Concord. The Human Provisional Delegation needed someone who could handle the harder Concord languages, not just the trade pidgin most humans learned, but the deep formal registers the delegates actually used among themselves. I could. So they hired me on contract for a year, and I packed one bag and took a berth on a freighter and went to live on the greatest station in the galaxy. I want you to understand that I went there in love with the place. Before I understood anything, I loved it. The first time the freighter came around the curve of that dead star, and I saw Meridian Concord, 40 kilometers of turning ring, lit gold along its axis, a whole inhabited world curving up into the light, I actually wept. I'm not ashamed to say it. I was a border world kid who'd grown up on stories of the ancient civilization out there among the stars, older than anything human, wiser than anything human, and here it was, real, turning slowly in the dark, more beautiful than the stories. I thought I was arriving at the pinnacle of everything thinking beings could build. And in a way I was. That's the thing. I wasn't wrong to love it. The Concord was magnificent. 11,000 years of peace, 43 species living together, the endless patient machinery of law that had ended the old wars and kept them ended. It was one of the genuine wonders of the galaxy, and it deserved the awe I brought to it. I've never stopped believing that. I just didn't understand yet that magnificent and doomed aren't opposites. That a thing can be the most beautiful thing anyone ever built and also be quietly dying of its own success. It took me 6 months on that station to see it, and even then I only saw it because I was a translator, and translators see things other people miss. Here's what I mean. When you translate, really translate at the deep level, not just swapping words but carrying meaning across the gap between two ways of thinking, you develop an ear for what a language can't say. Every language has holes in it, things it has no words for, because the people who speak it have no concept for them. And the holes tell you more about a people than the words do. What a civilization can't say is what it can't think, and what it can't think is where it's blind, and where it's blind is where it dies. The conquered languages had a hole exactly where the concept of desperate defense should have been. I noticed it early and it unsettled me, though I didn't understand why for months. The conquered had endless words for peace, for law, for order, for the graceful resolution of conflict. It had beautiful, precise, ancient vocabulary for every kind of negotiation, every shade of treaty, every nuance of the diplomacy that was its whole soul. But when I tried to translate certain human concepts, last stand, cornered, fighting a battle you might lose, holding a line against the odds, I hit the hole. There were no words, not just no exact words, no words at all. The concepts didn't exist. I'd have to build them out of circumlocutions, and the delegates would look at me with polite incomprehension, because I was describing a shape of experience their entire civilization had erased from itself. They had no word for a last stand. Think about what that means. A whole civilization, 43 species, 11,000 years, and not one of them had a word for the thing humans do when everything has gone wrong and they fight anyway. Because they never did it. Because they'd bred and lawed and civilized the very concept out of themselves, so thoroughly that it had fallen out of their languages entirely, the way a muscle you never use eventually withers off the bone. That was the hole. That was the thing that was going to kill them. And I felt it month after month, every time I hit that gap in the language, this cold unease I couldn't name, the translator's instinct telling me that a people who can't even say desperate defense are a people who won't be able to mount one on the day they finally need to. I didn't know how right I was. I didn't know the day was 6 weeks away. The other thing I should explain is why the human delegation was there at all, wanting in so badly, and why the wanting made us vulnerable. Humanity in those days was hungry, not for conquest, for belonging. We were 90 years into our time among the stars, and we'd spent all 90 of them being the new species, the young species, the one nobody quite took seriously. We'd made contact with a handful of minor powers, signed a few small treaties, but the conquered was the big one. The conquered was the club that mattered. Membership in the conquered meant legitimacy, meant trade, meant a seat at the oldest and grandest table in the galaxy. It meant we'd arrived. It meant we were finally somebody. So we wanted it. God, we wanted it. And wanting something that badly makes you weak in a particular way, it makes you willing to bend, to compromise, to swallow insults, to prove yourself over and over to people who have already decided what you are. Our whole delegation was bent into that shape. We were supplicants. We came hat in hand and we stayed hat in hand. And when the conquered asked us to prove we were civilized, we bent over backwards to prove it, because we wanted in so badly that we'd have proven almost anything. That's why the weapons ban gained traction the way it did, because it was aimed exactly at our weak spot. Prove you're civilized, put down the ugly weapons, show us you're not the savages we fear you are, and then you can belong. It was a test, and we were so desperate to pass it that a lot of us wanted to. A lot of our own delegation argued for accepting the ban. Just give them the weapons, they said. It's a small price. It's worth it to belong. What are a few ugly rifles against a seat at the 11,000-year table? Grace Halloran fought that instinct in our own delegation as hard as she fought Vesnutal's movement. Harder, maybe, because it's easier to resist an enemy than to resist your own people's longing to belong. I sat in on some of those internal arguments. I was translating station communications. I heard the delegation talk among itself, and I watched Grace hold a line that half her own people wanted to abandon. "I understand wanting to belong," she told them one long night in the human quarter. "I want it too. I've given years of my life to getting us this seat, but listen to me. A club that makes you disarm to join it isn't offering you a seat, it's offering you a collar. And the day you need your weapons back, and that day always comes for everyone eventually, you'll find you traded away your survival for the feeling of being accepted by people who never respected you enough to let you keep it." She looked around at them. "We can belong to the conquered as equals, weapons and all, or we can belong to it as pets. Those are the only two options. And I did not come all this way to make our species into anyone's pet. We keep the weapons. We keep what we are. And if the price of the seat is that we stop being able to protect ourselves, then the seat isn't worth the price, no matter how badly we want to sit in it." Most of the delegation came around. Not all, but most. And it turned out to matter enormously, because when the ban passed anyway over our objection, by the Concord's own vote, the fact that we'd argued against it on the record was part of what let Grace stand up in that chamber later with clean hands. We hadn't wanted this. We'd warned against it. We'd said plainly that disarming was a mistake. And then it had become a catastrophe within 25 minutes, and every word we'd said was suddenly, terribly vindicated. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. I keep doing that. Let me go back to the frontier and the stations going quiet, and the things Sithai told me that made me understand what was actually happening. You have to understand what the Concord was first, or none of this makes sense. The Concord of Star Nations was old. Old the way mountains are old, so old that its age had stopped being a fact about it and become the entire substance of it. 43 species, spread across a third of the galaxy, bound together in a web of treaties and trade agreements and shared law that went back in some form 11,000 years. 11,000 years. Humanity, by comparison, had been in space for about 90. And the Concord was proud of its age. Rightly, maybe. They'd done something genuinely remarkable. They'd taken 43 species who might have spent eternity killing each other and instead built a peace that held. A real peace. There hadn't been a proper war inside conquered space in something like 4,000 years. 4,000 years. Think about that. My species couldn't manage 400 years without a war. And here was this vast ancient civilization that had gone 4,000. They'd done it through law. That was the Concord's whole religion. If it had won, the rule of law applied evenly forever. Every dispute went to arbitration. Every grievance had a process. Every species surrendered a piece of its sovereignty to the whole, and in exchange, the whole guaranteed that no one would ever again solve a problem with a fleet. It was beautiful, in a way. It was one of the most beautiful things any collection of thinking beings had ever built. It was also, by the time I got there, completely exhausted. That's the part the histories skip. The Concord in its 11,000th year wasn't the vigorous thing that had ended the old wars. It was old and tired and terrified of change. It had built its peace so carefully, balanced it so precisely, that any disturbance felt like a threat to the whole structure. And it had spent so long without a real enemy that it had forgotten what danger actually looked like. Its militaries were ceremonial. Its warships were museums. Its soldiers spent their careers in dress uniforms at parades, and hadn't fired a weapon in anger in longer than my species had existed. Into this ancient, tired, gorgeous, brittle thing came humanity. And we terrified them. We didn't mean to. That's what I always want people to understand. We didn't come in swaggering, didn't come in threatening. When humanity made contact with the Concord, about 40 years before the vote, when our first deep-range ship stumbled across a Concord border station, we came in polite, hat in hand, a small new species asking to be let into the club. But we terrified them anyway, and it took me a long time on that station to understand why. It wasn't our technology. Our technology was mostly worse than theirs. They'd had 11,000 years to refine everything. We were still figuring out half of it. Our ships were cruder, our engines less efficient, our computers slower. In almost every measurable way, humanity was the primitive at the table. Except for one thing. We were better at violence, much, much better, and we were better at it precisely because we were young. See, the conquered species had evolved past their killing instincts mostly. 11,000 years of enforced peace does that. It selects, generation after generation, for the temperament that thrives in a peaceful, ordered society, and against the temperament that doesn't. By the time we met them, most conquered species genuinely could not comprehend the kind of violence that came naturally to us. Not physically couldn't, they had bodies, some of them quite formidable, but couldn't comprehend it. Couldn't think the way you have to think to be good at war. The instinct had been bred and taught and lawed out of them so thoroughly that it was simply gone. We still had it, all of it. 90 years in space and about 200,000 years of evolution before that, most of it spent killing each other with escalating creativity. We were, by conquered standards, a species of natural-born warriors who happened to also be able to do math. And our weapons reflected that. Human pattern weapons, that phrase they used in the vote, were a whole design philosophy the conquered found genuinely horrifying. Because our weapons were built to be used by people who expected to lose. That's the key. That's the thing they never understood until it was too late. Conquered weapons were built by a civilization that had won, that had achieved permanent security, that designed its few remaining arms for ceremony and deterrence, and the theoretical possibility of a threat that everyone assumed would never come. Their weapons were elegant, precise, beautiful, designed on the assumption that if they ever had to be used at all, they'd be used from a position of overwhelming superiority briefly, cleanly, and then put away. Human weapons were built by a species that had spent its entire history losing, getting cornered, being outnumbered, fighting from the bottom, from the ruins, from the last defensible room with the last working rifle. Our weapons were built to keep working when everything had gone wrong, to be usable by a wounded person with one hand, to function caked in mud, underwater in vacuum, after being dropped off a cliff, to be simple enough that a frightened conscript could learn one in an afternoon, and lethal enough that the same conscript could hold a line against something much bigger and stronger. The conquered looked at our weapons and saw savagery, primitiveness, ugliness. They looked at a human rifle, a brutal, simple, reliable thing, and they felt the way you'd feel finding a stone axe in a museum of fine art. Revulsion, mixed with a kind of fear they couldn't name. I understood the fear better than they did, I think, because I was human and I'd grown up around those weapons and I knew what they were actually for. They weren't for savagery. They were for surviving. Every ugly practical feature of a human weapon was an answer to a moment when a human being had been about to die and needed one more chance. That's what the conquered couldn't see. They saw the ugliness and missed the desperation underneath it, the 10,000 generations of our ancestors who'd lived because they'd built the thing that worked when nothing else did. I'd been on the station 6 months when the movement to ban our weapons started gaining real traction. The station was called Meridian Concord, a vast ring city in orbit around a dead star, the administrative heart of the whole civilization, where the great chamber sat and the delegates argued and the 11,000-year peace was maintained one tedious vote at a time. It was, I'll admit, one of the most magnificent things I've ever seen. A ring 40 kilometers across, turning slowly in the dark, its inner surface a landscape of gardens and towers and terraces, home to millions, lit by an artificial sun that ran the length of the axis. You could stand on a terrace and look up, and see the far side of the ring arching overhead, a whole inhabited world curving up and over you into the light. I loved it there for a while, before I understood what was happening. The anti-human movement had a leader, and I should tell you about him because he matters. His name was Counselor Vesnu Tao. He was a Draith, a heavy, dignified species, something like if a tortoise had evolved into a philosopher king, slow-moving and slow-speaking, and enormously respected. Vesnu Tal had spent his whole long life, Draith live centuries, as a guardian of the Concord's traditions. He genuinely believed in the peace. I want to be fair to him, because it would be easy to make him a villain, and he wasn't one, exactly. He was something more dangerous than a villain. He was a good man defending a good thing, who could not see that the thing he was defending had become a trap. Vesnu Tal looked at humanity and saw a threat to 4,000 years of peace. And in a sense he was right. We were a threat. Not because we wanted war, we didn't. We desperately wanted in, wanted to belong, wanted to trade and settle and be accepted. But because our very existence broke the assumption the Concord's peace was built on. The assumption that violence was a solved problem. That the killing instinct was a primitive thing all civilized species left behind. We were living proof that you could be spacefaring and civilized and still be, underneath, a species that knew exactly how to fight and hadn't forgotten a bit of it. That terrified Vesnu Tal, and so he built a movement around a simple, seductive idea. If human violence was the threat, then remove the tools of it. Ban human weapons. Not humanity, he was always careful about that, always insisted he had nothing against humans as people, just the weapons. Make them illegal. Make humanity disarm to Concord standards, surrender the ugly practical killing tools, and adopt the elegant ceremonial arms of civilized species. And then humanity could stay, could belong, could be safe and civilized like everyone else. It sounded so reasonable. That was the horror of it. It sounded so reasonable that even a lot of humans in the delegation half agreed. Why not? We wanted to belong. If putting down the ugly weapons was the price of admission to an 11,000-year peace, wasn't that a price worth paying? Weren't we better than our weapons anyway? I heard our own delegates argue it late at night in the human quarter of the station. Maybe Tal's right, they'd say. Maybe this is what growing up looks like. Maybe a mature species doesn't need weapons built for losing, because a mature species doesn't lose. And I'd sit there and listen and feel that cold thing in my stomach, because I knew in a way I couldn't quite articulate yet, that they were missing something. That there was a reason you didn't hand your weapons to someone just because they asked nicely. That the whole point of a weapon built for losing was that you kept it for the day you were losing, and that day never announced itself in advance. I just didn't know yet how soon that day was coming. The thing about the Concord's peace, the thing nobody on that station wanted to look at directly, was that it had a hole in it, and the hole had a name. The Sevran. I'd been hearing the name for months before I understood what it meant. It came up in the margins of things, a trade route that had to be replanned because of the Sevran, a border sector that delegates spoke of in lowered voices. A defensive appropriation that passed every year without debate, labeled only Sevran contingency. When I finally asked, I asked a Ithir colleague in the translation corps, an old cynical creature named Sithai who'd been at the Concord for 2 centuries. She got very quiet, and then she told me. The Sevran were not part of the Concord. They were the thing outside it. The one enemy the 11,000-year peace had never absorbed and never defeated, a species from beyond the Concord's edge, ancient and cold and utterly implacable, who had been raiding the Concord's frontier for as long as anyone could remember. Not conquering, not negotiating, just harvesting. They came in their black ships every few decades and they took populations, resources. Whole colonies, sometimes, gone in a night. And then they withdrew back into the dark, and the Concord licked its wounds and rebuilt and told itself it had survived, and waited for the next time. Why doesn't the Concord destroy them? I asked Sithai. 43 species, 11,000 years, you must outnumber them 1,000 to 1. We do, she said, it has never mattered. And she told me the thing that finally made me understand what humanity had wandered into. Dara. The Concord cannot fight the Sevran. Do you understand? Not will not, cannot. We have forgotten how. Our fleets are ceremonial. Our soldiers are dancers. We have 4,000 years of peace, and it has cost us the one thing the peace was supposed to protect, the ability to defend ourselves against something that does not want peace. When the Sevran come, we do not fight them. We endure them. We give them what they take, and we survive the taking, and we call it victory because we are still here. Her voice was very bitter. The peace is real, but it is a peace among ourselves. Against the Sevran there has never been peace. There has only been submission, dressed up as endurance, for longer than your species has existed. I sat with that for a long time. And then I asked the question that turned out to be the whole story. Sithai, I said, the vote to ban human weapons, Tal's movement. It's picking up support fast, faster than it should for something this big. Why now? Why the sudden urgency? Sithai looked at me with her ancient Ithir eyes. Because, she said, the frontier stations have gone quiet, 3 of them this past month, and the pattern is old and everyone on the council recognizes it and no one will say it aloud. She leaned close. The Sevran are coming, Dara, sooner than the usual cycle. The council knows. And Vesnutal, good, frightened Vesnutal, has decided that the most important thing to do, with the Sevran already on the horizon, is to make sure the one species in the Concord that still knows how to fight is disarmed before they arrive. She made the harmonic sound that in a Ithir is a bitter laugh. He is so afraid of human violence that he is racing to remove it from the board at the exact moment it might have saved us all. That is the Concord in its 11,000th year, child. That is what 4,000 years of peace does to a mind. It teaches you to fear the wolf so much that you throw away your only wolf the night the winter comes. The vote passed at 1422. And I want to tell you exactly what I felt sitting in that booth watching 40 species celebrate, because it wasn't anger. People always assume it was anger. It wasn't. It was grief. Because I understood in that moment what they'd just done. They'd looked at the one thing that could save them, and because it was ugly, because it frightened them, because it reminded them of a part of themselves they'd worked 11,000 years to forget, they'd made it illegal. Hours maybe before they'd need it most. And they were celebrating, cheering, congratulating themselves on their maturity, their civilization, their triumph over the human problem. I looked across the chamber to the human delegation. Our provisional ambassador was a quiet woman named Grace Halloran, ex-military, gray-haired, with a stillness about her that I'd come to recognize meant she was thinking very hard. She wasn't celebrating, obviously, but she wasn't angry either. She was watching the Concord celebrate with an expression I couldn't read, and after a moment she looked up at the translation booths, up at me, the only other human high enough to see the whole chamber at once, and our eyes met across all that distance. And she gave the smallest shake of her head, not anger, not even disappointment quite, something sadder, the look of someone watching a person they care about make a terrible mistake that can't be taken back. Then the alarm started. It came over the station's general channel, cutting through the celebration, and it was a sound I'd never heard before in 6 months on Meridian Concord, a low, rising, 3-tone wail that I would later learn hadn't been sounded in earnest in over 80 years. The celebration faltered. Delegates stopped mid-cheer. 40 species turned toward the great display that dominated the far wall of the chamber, where the station's status board had been showing the vote tallies, and where now, instead, something else was appearing. A tactical display, the Concord frontier, and moving into it from the dark beyond the edge, a swarm of contacts, black ships, more than anyone in that chamber had seen in their lifetimes, more than the records said had ever come at once. The Sevran were not coming sooner than the usual cycle. The Sevran were here, now today, within hours of the vote. And I watched 11,000 years of civilization stand frozen in that chamber, staring at the display, and I understood that every single one of them had just realized, at the same moment, what they'd done at 1422. They had disarmed the only species that could fight, and the enemy they couldn't fight had arrived to collect. I looked back at Grace Halloran. She was already standing, already moving toward the chamber floor, and on her face was the expression I'd been waiting 6 months to see on a human being in that place. The expression that finally understood that the moment had come. The moment you keep the weapon for. The moment nobody announces in advance. It had just announced itself. Let me back up, though. Because before I tell you what Grace Halloran did on that chamber floor, I need you to understand who she was and who we were, the human delegation on Meridian Concord. Because the histories turn us into something we weren't. They make us sound like we walked in knowing we'd be needed, biding our time, waiting to be proven right. It wasn't like that. We were scared. We were outnumbered 43-1 in a civilization that had just declared our whole way of surviving illegal. We didn't feel powerful, we felt cornered. Grace Halloran was our provisional ambassador, which was a fancy way of saying she was the human in charge of trying to get us accepted into a club that didn't want us. She'd been a soldier before she was a diplomat, a real one, decades in the human defense forces, the kind of service that leaves marks you can see in how a person holds still. She had this quality I've never been able to describe properly. A kind of banked stillness, like a fire turned down low. You'd be talking to her and she'd be perfectly calm, perfectly warm, and underneath it you'd feel this reserve. This sense that there was a great deal more there than she was showing, and that you very much wanted it to stay unshown. The Concord delegates found her baffling. They were used to human passion, were a loud species, by their standards, quick to laugh and argue and gesture. And here was this quiet gray-haired woman who almost never raised her voice, who listened more than she spoke, who could sit through hours of insult and provocation without her expression changing. They didn't know what to make of her. Some of them mistook the stillness for weakness, for submission. I heard a Draith aide once refer to her as the tame human, and it took everything I had not to laugh, because I'd seen Grace Halloran's service record, and there was nothing tame about it. The rest of us were a mixed bunch. 40 or so humans, diplomats, trade specialists, a few scientists, support staff, and me, the contract translator. Most of us were civilians. Most of us had never fired a weapon at anything that could fire back. We weren't warriors. We were ordinary people, a long way from home, trying to represent our species well in a place that had already decided what our species was. And I want to be honest about the disarmament because it's the heart of everything. When the vote passed, most of us complied. We didn't have a choice, really 30 days to surrender all human pattern weapons, and we were 40 people on a station of millions. There was talk that first hour of refusing, of making a stand, but Grace shut it down fast and hard. We are not going to be the thing they're afraid of, she told us in the human quarter that first evening. They passed a law. We're guests. We follow the law or we prove every word Vesnutal ever said about us. We surrender the weapons, all of them. On the record, cooperatively, with dignity. So we did, or we started to. The station security services came to collect our defensive arms. The delegation was permitted a small armory, standard for any provisional member, and they came to seal and remove it. And we let them. Grace stood there and watched them cart away the human weapons, and she didn't say a word, and I remember thinking she looked like a woman watching something being buried. There was one thing she didn't surrender. I didn't know it at the time. Nobody did. I only found out later, and I'll tell you when I get there because it matters, and because it's the kind of small human detail the histories always miss. The frontier stations going quiet, that was the sign, and Grace had read it before any of us. I learned this afterward, piecing it together. While the rest of us had been focused on the vote, on the insult of it, on the politics, Grace had been watching the frontier. She'd seen the same 3 stations go dark that Sithai told me about. She'd recognized the pattern from the Concord's own historical records, which she'd been quietly studying for months. The records of every Sevran incursion going back millennia, the timing, the approach vectors, the way the frontier always went quiet first. She'd known. Days before the vote, she'd known the Sevran were coming and coming early and coming in force. and she tried to tell them. That's the part that breaks my heart, honestly. She tried. In the days before the vote, Grace Halloran requested private audiences with a dozen senior counselors, including Vesnutal himself, and she laid it out for them. The frontier pattern, the historical timing, her assessment, her professional, decades of military experience assessment, that a major Sevran incursion was not years away but weeks, maybe days, and that this was precisely the wrong moment to disarm the one species that could help. They didn't believe her, or worse, some of them did believe her, and it didn't change their minds. Because to Vesnutal and his movement, the imminence of the Sevran wasn't a reason to keep human weapons. It was a reason to ban them faster. If the Sevran were coming, then the danger of having an armed, warlike, unpredictable human presence in conquered space during a crisis was greater than ever. Better to have humanity disarmed and dependent and safely under conquered control before the enemy arrived, than to have us armed and dangerous, and possibly making everything worse with our primitive violence. I've thought a lot about how a smart, good person like Vesnutal could get it that wrong, and I think the answer is that he wasn't reasoning about the Sevran at all, not really. He was reasoning about us. Humanity had gotten so deeply into the conquered spheres that even the arrival of their ancient enemy got processed, in Tal's mind, as fundamentally a human problem. The Sevran were a known quantity, a disaster you endured like weather. Humanity was the new thing, the unpredictable thing, the thing that might change the equation in ways you couldn't control. And so, faced with two dangers, Tal moved against the one that frightened him more. The new one, us. Grace saw it happening and couldn't stop it, and so she did the only thing left to do. She prepared. Quietly, without telling most of us, she got ready for the day she was sure was coming. And when the alarm sounded in that chamber, minutes after the vote, she wasn't surprised. She was the only person in that entire chamber of thousands who wasn't surprised. She'd been right. God, she'd been so right. And being right had cost her everything, because they'd disarmed us anyway, and now the enemy was here and the weapons were sealed in a conquered vault, and there were 40 humans and no guns and a swarm of black ships coming out of the dark. That was the situation at 14:31 station time, 9 minutes after the most important vote in the Concord's recent history. That was where we stood. I'll tell you what happened next. But first I have to tell you what the chamber was like in those first minutes, because I've never seen anything like it and I hope I never do again. Panic has a sound. I learned that on Meridian Concord. I'd never heard a whole civilization panic before. It's not like individual fear. It's not screaming, not mostly. It's a low collective sound, a rising drone of thousands of voices all pitching up at once, all asking the same questions, none of them getting answers. 43 species have 43 ways of showing fear, and when you hear them all at once, in one enormous chamber, it becomes a single terrible noise that gets into your bones. The tactical display kept updating. The swarm of black ships kept growing, and the numbers next to them, the Concord's threat assessments, generated by systems that hadn't been seriously tested in generations, kept climbing, and climbing past every threshold into red, into a color I didn't even know the display had, a deep pulsing crimson that I understood without being told meant beyond our capacity to respond. Because that was the thing. That was the thing the whole chamber was realizing at once, the thing under the panic. They couldn't respond. Sithai had told me and I hadn't fully believed her, but now I watched it become real in front of me. The Concord had no answer. Its fleets were ceremonial. Its soldiers were dancers. 43 species and 11,000 years. And when the real threat came out of the dark, the mightiest civilization in the galaxy stood in its great chamber and made the sound of a cornered animal, because it had forgotten deliberately, proudly, over 4,000 years, how to be anything else. The speaker was trying to restore order. The silver Ithyr with the canyon wind voice, hammering her ceremonial rod, calling for calm, calling for the emergency protocols. But the emergency protocols were for emergencies the Concord actually knew how to handle: trade disputes, diplomatic incidents, the occasional natural disaster. There was no protocol for this. There hadn't been a protocol for this in 4,000 years. The machinery of the Great Peace ground and produced nothing, because it had never been built to produce the one thing now required, which was the will and the skill to fight. And in the middle of all of it, Vesnutal sat frozen at the councilor's dais. I could see him from the booth. The heavy, dignified Draith, the good, frightened man, the architect of the band that was, at that very moment, curdling from a triumph into the worst mistake in the recent history of his civilization. He wasn't panicking. Draith don't, really, they're too slow, too deliberate. He was just sitting there, staring at the display at the crimson numbers, and I watched the understanding move across him like a shadow. I watched him do the arithmetic. Human weapons banned at 1422. Sevran confirmed inbound at 1429. 7 minutes. He disarmed the Concord's only defenders 7 minutes before the enemy arrived. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because whatever else he was, he had to live now with a piece of timing so cruel that no one who understood it would ever forgive him, least of all himself. And then Grace Halloran reached the chamber floor. She didn't shout. That's the thing I remember most. The whole chamber was drowning in noise, thousands of voices, the alarm still wailing, the speaker hammering, and Grace Halloran walked out onto the floor of the great chamber, this small gray-haired human, and she didn't add to the noise. She just walked to the central speaking position, the place from which delegates addressed the Concord, and she stood there, quietly, waiting. And somehow that was louder than shouting, a still point in all that chaos. One person calm in the middle of a civilization coming apart. People noticed her precisely because she wasn't panicking. The drone faltered here and there as delegates saw her standing there, waiting, patient, and something about the sight of it started to pull the chamber's attention toward her. The speaker saw her. And the speaker, I'll give the old Ither credit, she understood in that moment that the normal order of things had ended and something new was required. The speaker stopped hammering and pointed her rod at Grace and said, "Into the failing chaos. The human delegation is recognized." It got quiet, not all at once, but it got quiet in waves, thousands of terrified beings going silent to hear what the one calm person in the room was going to say. Grace let the silence settle. She was good at that. She looked around the chamber slowly, taking in all of them, the 43 species, the frozen counselors, Vesnutal, the crimson display burning behind them all. And then she spoke, and her voice wasn't loud but it carried, because the chamber had gone so quiet, and because there was something in it that made you listen. 2 hours ago, Grace said, I requested this body's permission to help you prepare for what is now on your screens. That request was denied. 7 minutes ago, this body voted to seal the only weapons in this station capable of engaging what is now on your screens. I want that on the record, not to shame anyone, to make sure that when this is over, and it will be over, one way or another, we all remember exactly how we got here. Because you built 11,000 years of law on the principle that the record matters. It matters now more than it ever has. Nobody said anything. The alarm wailed on. Now, Grace said, and her voice changed, dropped the diplomat entirely, became something older and harder, the soldier underneath. Here is where we actually are. You have perhaps 3 hours before those ships reach the station. You have no fleet that can stop them. You have no soldiers who can fight them. You have 43 species who have forgotten how to do the one thing that is now required, and you have 40 humans who have not forgotten, and you have just voted to take our tools away. She let that sit. So this is the choice in front of you, and you need to make it in the next few minutes, because after that the choice will make itself. You can hold to the law you passed at 1422 and keep our weapons sealed, and face what is coming with ceremony and dignity and no chance at all. Or you can unseal that vault and give us back our tools, and let the species you were so afraid of show you what those ugly primitive weapons were actually built for." She looked directly at Vesnutal when she said the last part, not cruelly, just directly. "You called them weapons for losing," she said. "You were right. That's exactly what they are. We built them for the worst day. For the day you're outnumbered and outgunned and cornered and there's no help coming and the only thing between your people and the end is you and the tool in your hands." She looked back out at the whole chamber. "This is that day. This is the exact day we built them for. And you've locked them in a box 7 minutes before you needed them because they were too ugly to look at." A pause. "Unseal the vault. Let us help you. Or don't, and endure the Sevran the way you always have and lose whatever they decide to take this time. But decide now, because they are not going to wait for you to hold a debate." And then Grace Halloran stopped talking and stood there in the center of the great chamber, calm as still water, and waited for 11,000 years of civilization to decide whether it wanted to survive. I have never before or since watched a silence so heavy. Thousands of beings, 43 species, the alarm wailing, the black ships growing on the display. And one human woman, standing quietly in the middle of it, having just offered them the only thing that could save them, waiting to see if they were too proud and too frightened to take it. I held my breath in that booth. And then from the counselor's dais, slow and heavy and deliberate, Vesnutal rose to his feet. He spoke slowly. Draith always do, but this was slower even than that, the slowness of a being choosing each word against the full weight of what it would cost him. "The human ambassador is correct," Vesnutal said. "In all particulars, she warned us. We did not listen. She offered to help us prepare. We refused. And 7 minutes before the enemy arrived on my motion by my urging, we disarmed the only defenders among us." He paused, and the whole chamber hung on it. "I have spent my life in service to the peace of this Concord. I still believe that the peace is the greatest thing our peoples ever made. And I believe that human weapons, human violence, human readiness for war was a threat to that peace. I was not wrong that it is dangerous. I was wrong about everything else." He turned slowly, his heavy head swinging to face the crimson display, the growing swarm. "I looked at their weapons and I saw savagery," he said. "I see now that I was looking at a mirror and could not bear my own reflection, because those weapons are not savagery. They are memory. They are the memory of every time a people faced the end and refused it. We forgot that memory. We were proud to forget it. We called our forgetting civilization." His voice, slow and deep, filled the silent chamber. "And now the end has come for us as it comes for everyone eventually, and we stand here with our beautiful ceremonial arms and our 4,000 years of peace, and we cannot lift a hand to save ourselves because we bred the hand away." He was quiet for a moment. "The humans kept the memory. That is their whole crime. They remembered what we chose to forget. And I moved to punish them for it, at the worst possible moment. And if we survive the next 3 hours, it will be despite me, not because of me." He turned back to the speaker, and Counselor Vesnutal, architect of the band, did the hardest thing I ever saw anyone do in that chamber. "I move," he said, "to suspend the law passed at 1422. Immediately. I move to unseal the human armory and return to the human delegation every weapon we took from them. And I move that we place the defense of this station, for the duration of this emergency, in the hands of Ambassador Grace Halloran and the human delegation, because they are the only ones among us who know how to conduct it." His slow eyes swept the chamber. "I have been the loudest voice against these people for 2 years. Let me now be the first to say it. We need them. We need exactly the thing we were afraid of. And I would rather live to be ashamed of my error than die still proud of it. I so move." The speaker didn't even call for the usual process. There wasn't time, and everyone knew it. "The motion is before the Concord," she said. "All who consent signal now." And the chamber lit up, not with the slow ceremonial voting of 11,000 years of tradition, but with a fast, desperate, unanimous flood of consent signals. thousands of them, 43 species all at once, every delegate in that vast chamber signaling the same thing. Yes, yes, unseal it, give them back their weapons, please save us. The same body that had banned human weapons at 1422 voted to return them at 1447. 25 minutes. That's how long the ban on human weapons actually lasted in practice. From the moment it passed to the moment they begged us to take our weapons back. 25 minutes and one glimpse of the thing the weapons were actually for. The histories say hours later every star nation regretted it. The histories are being generous. It was 25 minutes. Grace Halloran received the vote without any visible reaction. No triumph. No I told you so. She simply nodded once and turned to the speaker and said, "Then we don't have time to waste. Unseal the vault. Get my people their weapons. And get me every schematic you have on this station's defensive systems, its docking rings, its internal security layout, and the Sevran, everything you know about how they board and how they fight." She was already moving, already command, the diplomat gone entirely now, the soldier fully arrived. "We have less than 3 hours. It's not enough. We'll make it work anyway. That's the other thing we're good at." And she looked up one more time at the translation booths at me, and this time she didn't shake her head. This time she just caught my eye and gave the smallest nod, and I understood it as an order, though I couldn't have told you an order to do what. I found out fast, because 30 seconds later my booth comm lit up with her voice. "Okonkwo, you're the only other human who's been watching this whole chamber for 6 months. You know these delegates, who's steady, who's going to break, who actually controls the station systems under all the ceremony. I need that in my ear for the next 3 hours. Get down here." A pause. "And Dara, whatever you thought your job was when you took this contract, it just changed. You're not translating anymore. You're helping me keep 3 million people alive. You up for it?" I looked out at the chamber, at the crimson display, at the black ships coming out of the dark, at the 43 species who just handed their survival to 40 humans and one very frightened contract translator. "Yes, ma'am," I heard myself say. "I'm up for it." "Good," said Grace Halloran. "Then let's go to work." I left the booth at a dead run. Behind me, the alarm still wailed, and the vault was already grinding open, and the human delegation was moving through the panicking chamber with a calm purpose that made the conquered species stop and stare. Because they were seeing it now, finally, the thing they'd been so afraid of, and for the first time they understood that it hadn't come to hurt them. It had come to stand between them and the dark. That's what human weapons were always for. That's what we were always for. They just had to be about to die to see it. Well, they were about to die now. And they were about to see it. The next 3 hours were the strangest of my life, and I've had some strange ones. I ran down out of that booth and onto the chamber floor, and by the time I reached Grace Halloran, she'd already turned the ceremonial heart of the Concord into a command post. It happened that fast. She'd commandeered the counselor's dais, spread schematics across it, and gathered around her the handful of humans in our delegation who had military backgrounds. There were 6 of them. Out of our 40, 6 people who'd worn a uniform before they wore a diplomat's robes. And she was giving orders, quiet and fast, and those 6 were moving. I want to describe what that looked like from the outside, because it's the thing the conquered species couldn't stop staring at, and I finally understood watching it, what actually frightened them about us. It wasn't that we were violent. It was that we were organized about it. The Concord in its panic was chaos. 43 species all reacting differently, all their emergency systems designed for problems that weren't this one. Nobody quite in charge because 11,000 years of consensus government had bred out the instinct for one person to simply take command and be obeyed. They were brave enough, most of them. I don't want to make them sound like cowards, they weren't. But they were lost. They didn't have the software for this. Faced with imminent violence, they had no organizing principle, no muscle memory, nothing to fall back on. We did, 6 humans with military training and 1 terrified translator, and within minutes we were a machine. Grace at the center, calm, deciding. The 6 fanning out, each taking a piece. This one to the vault to arm and organize, that one to the docking rings to survey defensive positions, that one to the station's own security forces to try to weld them into something useful. Clear roles, clear reporting, everyone knowing what to do and doing it without being asked twice. It wasn't that we were braver or stronger than the conquered. It was that when the killing came, we had a way of moving through it that they had lost. 10,000 generations of doing exactly this had left it in us like a reflex. Sithai found me on the dais about 10 minutes in. My old Ithir colleague, the cynical 2nd-century translator. She'd come down from the booths too, unable to stay away, and she stood watching the humans work with an expression I'd never seen on her. "I have been at this Concord for 200 years, she said quietly. "I have never seen anyone simply decide and be followed. We debate, we consent, we process. Your ambassador looked at 3 million lives in 3 hours and she simply began and the rest of you simply moved." She made a low sound. "This is the thing we forgot, isn't it? Not the weapons, the ability to act. The weapons are just the tools. The real thing you kept that we lost, it's this. The knowing how to begin." She was right. I've thought about it for years since, and she was exactly right. The weapons were never the point. Vesnu Tal banned the weapons because the weapons were visible, were tangible, were a thing you could vote against. But the weapons were only the outermost layer of the thing that actually made humanity dangerous. Underneath the weapons was the training. Underneath the training was the organization. And underneath the organization, all the way at the bottom, was the simple, terrible human refusal to freeze. The thing our ancestors had bought with 200,000 years of blood, the ability to look at the worst moment of your life and act instead of stand still. You can't ban that. You can't seal it in a vault. It's in us whether we're armed or not, and the weapons just let it reach further. Grace pulled me in close, in the middle of all of it, and put me to work. My job, it turned out, was to be her map of the conquered. 6 months of watching those delegates from the translation booths had given me something none of the other humans had. I knew them. I knew which counselors were steady and which were coming apart. I knew who actually controlled the station systems under all the ceremonial layers. I knew that the speaker, for all her authority, didn't command the docking ring engineers, and that the being who did was a quiet, unglamorous Vathalan section chief named Ro, who never spoke in the great debates but could open or seal any bulkhead on the station. I knew who to trust with a real task and who would just get in the way. So I stood at Grace's shoulder and I fed it to her. "Not him, he's ceremonial, no real authority, he'll waste your time." Her, talk to her. She runs environmental and she's steady. The docking rings are controlled from section control, not the dais. You need Ro, the Vathalan, I'll find her. That counselor's about to break, get him off the floor before the panic spreads from him. On and on, for 3 hours, the human ambassador and the human translator, welding a panicking ancient civilization into something that could maybe, possibly, survive the night. And Grace listened to every word. That's the thing about her I'll never forget. In the middle of the worst crisis imaginable, with 3 million lives on her shoulders and minutes counting down, she listened to a frightened contract translator like every word mattered. Because it did, and she knew it did, and she was too good at her job to let pride or panic close her ears. She took my read on the conquered and she used it, and half the things that worked in those 3 hours worked because a translator who'd been watching from a booth knew which alien to ask. The armory came first. The vault ground open and our 6 military humans got to the weapons, and I watched something I'd been told for 6 months was savagery, and saw instead something almost tender. They didn't grab the weapons and brandish them. They checked them, methodically, calmly, the way you'd handle something you respected and feared in equal measure. Cleared each one, inspected it, confirmed it functioned, laid it out in order. Distributed them not by rank or eagerness but by competence, who could actually use what. And they talked quietly while they did it, a kind of low, steady patter that I realized was how they kept each other calm. Small jokes, steady hands, the banked fire stillness that Grace had, turning out to be a thing all of them had, all six, the mark of people who'd been trained for exactly this and had hoped their whole lives never to need it. One of them, a big quiet man named Petrov, ex-defense forces, who'd been a trade specialist for our delegation, caught me watching. He must have seen something on my face because he paused, a rifle half-checked in his hands, and he said, "First time seeing this, huh?" "Yeah," I admitted. "It's not what they think it is." He nodded out at the Concord delegates who were watching us arm with a mix of hope and residual horror. "They think this is us getting excited, getting our teeth. It's the opposite. Every one of us is praying we don't have to use these. You check a weapon this carefully because you're hoping the care is enough, that if you do it all exactly right, maybe nobody has to die. Maybe the readiness alone does it." He went back to the rifle, cleared it, set it down gentle. "The ones who get excited about this, they wash out in training. The ones who make it through are the ones who understand exactly what these things do and carry them anyway because someone has to, and better it's someone who understands." He looked up at me. "You want to help? Stay next to the ambassador. Be her eyes on these aliens. That's a real job and you're the only one who can do it. Leave the guns to us." I did, but I never forgot what he said. You carry them anyway because someone has to, and better it's someone who understands. That's humanity's whole relationship with violence, right there, said by a quiet man checking a rifle he prayed he wouldn't fire. We're not good at war because we love it. The ones who love it wash out. We're good at it because we understand it, and we're willing to carry the understanding so that someone gentler doesn't have to. I promised back at the start that I'd tell you about the one thing Grace Halloran didn't surrender when the ban passed. This is where it belongs, so I'll tell you now. When the station security services came to collect our armory, cooperatively, on the record with dignity, the way Grace insisted, they took everything. Every human pattern weapon in the delegation's possession. Grace watched them cart it all away and said nothing. Except she kept one thing back. Not a weapon exactly. A single case small that she'd registered months earlier not as armament but as diplomatic materials, personal, a category the Concord's own rules exempted from search and seizure, because 11,000 years of diplomatic tradition held that a delegate's personal effects were inviolable. Grace had read those rules the way she read everything, carefully, looking for the gap. And she'd found it. And months before the ban ever came to a vote, on the strength of her read of the frontier and the Sevran and the pattern of stations going quiet, she'd quietly moved one thing into that protected category. It wasn't a gun. When she finally opened the case in the 3 hours of preparation, I saw what it was, and I didn't understand at first. It was tools. Fabrication tools. The compact, brutal, portable kind that human field engineers used to make weapons, to turn raw station materials into the ugly practical things we needed, fast, from nothing. Because Grace had understood something the Concord never did. The weapons weren't the dangerous thing. The knowledge was. You can confiscate every gun in a delegation's armory, and it doesn't matter because the humans who carried them know how to make more. Out of pipe. Out of scrap. Out of whatever a station is built from. The Concord had spent so long thinking of weapons as objects, things you could count, seal, ban, that they never grasped that to humanity, a weapon isn't an object. It's a piece of knowledge that happens to be wearing the shape of an object. Take the object away and the knowledge remains, and the knowledge can always make another object. So when the vault ground open and our confiscated weapons came back, that was good, it saved time. But Grace had been ready to fight even if the vault had stayed sealed. She'd have made what we needed in those 3 hours out of the station itself, with the tools she'd protected under a diplomatic technicality months before she knew for certain she'd need them. That was the level she operated on. She'd outlawyered the ban before it even existed, quietly just in case, because that's what it means to actually be ready not to have the weapon, but to be unable to be disarmed, because the weapon was never really the thing. You were the thing. The knowledge was the thing. And you can't seal a person's knowledge in a vault. I asked her later whether she'd have told anyone about the tools if the vote hadn't gone the way it did, if the ban had somehow been avoided, and she said no. I hoped I'd never opened that case, she said. I registered it and I prayed I was wrong about all of it, the frontier, the Sevran, the timing. I'd have been happy to carry those tools home unused and feel foolish for having worried. That's the thing people misunderstand about being ready. Being ready isn't wanting the bad thing to come so you can use what you prepared. It's the opposite. You prepare as hard as you can, and then you pray with everything you've got that the preparation turns out to be wasted. The best case outcome is always that you feel a little foolish for having bothered. I have felt foolish for bothering many times in my life. It's a good feeling. It means the bad day didn't come. She'd looked at the tools at the case. This time it came. But I'd have traded the whole vindication for one more day of feeling foolish. Being right about this kind of thing is never worth what it costs to be right. Being right is never worth what it costs to be right. I think about that whenever someone tells this story as a triumph, as humanity proven right, vindicated, the doubters silenced. Grace never felt triumphant. She felt the cost. She'd have given up every bit of being right to have been wrong, to have carried those tools home unused, to have let the conquered keep its comfortable illusion one more year. The vindication was real. It just wasn't worth 2 lives and a battle and a man weeping on a doorstep. It never is. The people who actually know don't celebrate being right about the darkness. They just quietly prepare for it, and pray they're wrong and grieve when they're not. The Sevran reached the station at 17:41. We had 3 hours to prepare and we used every second. By the time the black ships filled the display, Grace had done something I would have called impossible. She'd turned Meridian Concord from a panicking ceremonial ring city into something that could actually be defended. Not well, not the way a real fortress could be defended, but defended. She'd concentrated everything on the docking rings because that, she'd determined from the Concord's own records, was how the Sevran fought. They didn't blast stations to rubble. That would waste what they came to harvest. They boarded. They came in their black ships and they latched onto the docking rings and they poured through, and they took what they wanted hand to hand, corridor by corridor, and the Concord had never been able to stop them because the Concord could not fight hand to hand in a corridor. That was the most human kind of fighting there was. Close, ugly, personal. The exact kind of fighting our weapons were built for and their weapons weren't. So Grace gave up the outer station, pulled everyone back, concentrated the population in the core, behind bulkhead after bulkhead that Rose engineers could seal, and set the defense at the choke points, the narrow corridors where the Sevran would have to funnel through, where numbers mattered less and a few humans with the right weapons could hold against many. We can't beat them in open space, she told the assembled counselors an hour before contact. Their ships outnumber and outgun everything you have, so we don't fight them in space. We let them come aboard, we let them think they're winning, and we meet them in the corridors where their advantage means nothing and ours means everything. She'd looked at Vesnutal when she said it. You spent 11,000 years learning to fight in the open, cleanly, at a distance. The Sevran learned to fight that way too, that's why they always beat you. Neither of you ever learned the other kind of fighting, the desperate kind, the cornered kind, the kind you do when you've already lost and you fight anyway, a grim almost smile. We never learned anything else. Welcome to a human war, counselor. It's going to be ugly. Ugly is what we're good at. I was in the core with Grace when the boarding began. She'd kept me close, her eyes on the Concord still, and also, I think, because she'd taken a kind of responsibility for me, the young translator she'd pulled into the fire. I watched the whole thing through the station's internal sensors. The feeds Rose people patched through to our command position, and I'm going to tell you what I saw, though I've never been able to tell it without my hands shaking a little, even now. The Sevran came through the docking rings exactly as Grace predicted. I saw them for the first time on the feeds, and they were terrible, genuinely terrible, and I understood at last why 11,000 years of civilization had never been able to face them. They were tall and fast and armored in something dark that seemed to drink the light, and they moved through the outer corridors of the station with a horrible flowing certainty, like they'd done this 1,000 times, which they had. They met no resistance at first. The outer station was empty. Grace had pulled everyone back, and I could see in the way they moved that they thought this was another easy harvest, another submission dressed up as endurance. Another night of taking what they wanted from a civilization that couldn't stop them. They flowed inward, toward the core, toward the choke points. And that's where they met the humans. I need to tell this part carefully, because it's the part everyone gets wrong, and because the 6 people who did it deserve to have it told right. There were 6 of them. 6 humans with military training, plus a handful of Concord volunteers Grace had managed to train just enough to be useful in support roles, carrying ammunition, sealing bulkheads, dragging the wounded. 6 humans, against a boarding force that the censors numbered in the hundreds. It should have been impossible. By every law of arithmetic, it should have been a slaughter. But arithmetic isn't the only law, and the corridors of Meridian Concord were built to a plan Grace had studied for 3 hours, and the humans knew things about fighting in narrow spaces that the Sevran, for all their age and skill, had never had to learn, because they'd never faced anyone who could fight them there. The first contact happened at a junction the humans called Chokepoint 3, a narrow curved corridor where 4 passages funneled into one, where the Sevran had to come single file or nearly so, and where Petrov and 2 others were waiting. I watched it on the feed. I watched the first Sevran come around the curve, fast and certain and expecting nothing, and I watched Petrov, big quiet Petrov who told me the ones who love it wash out. I watched him do the thing he'd trained his whole life for and prayed he'd never have to do. He was calm. That's what undid me, watching it. In the middle of the most desperate fight imaginable, he was calm and precise and economical. No wasted movement, no panic. The banked fire stillness turned all the way up into its true purpose. He and the 2 others held that choke point against a force that outnumbered them impossibly, and they held it not through fury but through discipline, through the accumulated craft of a species that had been fighting from cornered positions since before it had language. The Sevran, for the first time in their long history of harvesting the conquered, met something that fought back and knew how, and they didn't know what to do. I could see it on the feeds. Their horrible flowing certainty faltered. They'd never needed a plan for resistance because they'd never met resistance. They came around that curve expecting submission, and they met Petrov, and the corridor filled with the ugly practical reality of human weapons, doing exactly what human weapons were built to do, and the Sevran advance stopped. Stopped. For the first time in 4,000 years, a Sevran boarding stopped, at a curved corridor on Meridian Concord, because 6 humans and a translator and a disgraced Draith counselor and a quiet Vothalan engineer had decided it would. I want to try to describe what the fighting was actually like, from where I sat, because the word battle is too clean for it, and I don't want to give you the clean version. From the command position, I had the feeds, dozens of them, patched through by Rose people, views into corridors all across the contested zone. And I watched all of it, because that was part of my job, watching and telling Grace what I saw. So I saw more of that battle than almost anyone, more than the soldiers who could only see their own piece of it. I saw the whole terrible shape of it at once. And the thing I remember most is how slow it was, and how fast, both at the same time. The lulls stretched forever, long minutes of nothing, of waiting, of the humans at their choke points breathing and checking their weapons, and saying quiet things to each other while the Sevran regrouped somewhere out of sight. And then the contact would come and everything would happen in seconds, a compressed violent blur, and then it would be over and the slow waiting would start again. War isn't constant, I learned. It's mostly waiting, punctuated by moments so fast and so total that your mind can't quite hold them. The waiting is almost worse than the moments. In the moments you're too busy to be afraid. In the waiting, the fear has room to grow. I watched Petrov through a lot of it, because his feed was the clearest, and because something about watching him steadied me. He fought the way he described it to me, calm, economical, no wasted motion. But it wasn't cold exactly. That's the thing I want to correct, because people imagine soldiers as cold in battle, and it isn't true, or at least it wasn't true of him. He wasn't cold. He was present, utterly focused, everything in him gathered to the single point of the task in front of him. There was even, I swear, a kind of tenderness in it, in how he covered his position, how he called warnings to the volunteers near him, how he pulled a wounded Ithier back out of the line of fire in a lull without breaking his own readiness for a second. He was, in the middle of all that killing, taking care of people. That's what discipline actually looks like up close, not coldness. Care made steady enough to function under fire. There was a moment, maybe the third hour, that I've never told anyone about, and I'll tell you now, because it's the truest thing I know about what humans are. A Sevran broke through at a junction near Petrov's position, got past the choke point somehow in the chaos, and came up on a cluster of Concord volunteers who weren't ready for it, support personnel, unarmed or barely armed, the ones who carried ammunition and dragged the wounded. They were about to die, all of them. The Sevran was among them, and they had nothing to stop it. And Petrov left his position to save them. That sounds simple. It wasn't. His position was a choke point, the thing holding back the main Sevran advance. Leaving it meant opening the line, meant risking the whole defense, meant that if he was wrong about being able to get back in time, everyone died. By every rule of the tactics he'd been trained in, he should have held his position and let the volunteers die. 6 lives against the whole line. The math was obvious. He left anyway, crossed the open junction under fire, reached the volunteers, put himself between them and the Sevran, and dealt with it fast, brutal, the ugly practical reality, and then got them moving, got them back, and threw himself back into his own position half a second before the main advance hit it again. He'd gambled everything, against his own training, against the math, to save 6 people who carried ammunition, and he'd won the gamble barely by half a second. I asked him about it afterward, why he'd done it, why he'd risked the whole line for 6 support staff. He looked at me like he didn't understand the question. They were going to die, he said. But the line's just a line, he said. It's a place on a map. It doesn't mean anything by itself. The only reason the line matters is because there are people behind it. So the day you hold the line by letting the people in front of you die, you've forgotten what the line was for. The line's for the people, all of it's for the people. You lose that, you've lost the whole reason you're standing there, and then you're just a machine defending a coordinate. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. I didn't do the math. You're right that the math said hold. I just couldn't watch 6 people die 20 meters away and do nothing, so I didn't. Sometimes you have to trust that the right thing and the smart thing are closer together than the math makes them look. This time they were, won't always be, but I'd do it again. That's humanity, right there. Not the weapons, not the tactics, not the discipline, those are just tools. That underneath. A man who couldn't watch people die 20 meters away and do nothing, who left the safe correct position to cross fire for 6 strangers carrying ammunition, who trusted that the right thing and the smart thing were closer than they looked. The conquered had spent 11,000 years afraid that human violence would be pointed at them. And here was human violence, up close, in its truest form, a man breaking every rule of war to save the helpless, because the helpless were the whole point of the war. They'd been so afraid of the wrong thing. They'd never understood what our capacity for violence was actually in service of. I want to tell you about Vesnu Tal during the fight, because it's the part of him that redeems him, and he earned the telling. He didn't hide. That's the first thing. A being of his age and rank and dignity could have retreated to the core with the other counselors, could have let the humans and the volunteers do the dying while he waited safely for the outcome. Nobody would have blamed him. He was old and slow and heavy and utterly untrained for anything like this. Instead, he went to the choke points. Not to fight, he couldn't fight. His body wasn't built for it, and he knew it. He went to carry ammunition mostly. The humans burned through their limited supply fast in those corridors, and someone had to move it from the vault to the firing positions, through contested space under fire, and it turned out that a heavy, slow, armored Draith was very good at exactly that. His shell could take hits that would kill a human. His slow, deliberate strength could haul loads that would break a lighter body. And so Vesnu Tal, the architect of the ban, the man who'd called human weapons savagery, spent the 6 hours of the battle hauling human weapons and human ammunition through burning corridors to the humans who needed them, so they could kill the enemy he'd left the conquered defenseless against. I saw him on the feeds, this ancient dignified being, moving through the smoke with a load of ammunition on his back, slow and steady and utterly exposed, bringing the ugly primitive tools to the people using them to save his civilization. And I watched him reach Petrov's position at choke point 3 in a lull and set down his load, and I watched the two of them look at each other, the disgraced counselor and the quiet soldier, and I would have given anything to hear what passed between them. I asked Petrov afterward what Tal said. He apologized, Petrov told me. In the middle of it, set down the ammo and looked at me and said he was sorry for the ban, for all of it, and I told him. Petrov paused. I told him to save it, not because I was angry, because there wasn't time and because it didn't matter anymore and because the apology I actually wanted was the ammunition on his back. I told him, you want to say sorry, keep the rounds coming. That's the only apology that matters right now. And he did. Old as he was, hurt as he got, and he got hurt, took a hit in the 4th hour that would have dropped a younger being, he kept the rounds coming. Every time I looked up, there he was, slowest, oldest, bravest thing in those corridors. Petrov shook his head. I don't forgive easy, but I forgave him. You can't watch a man haul ammunition through fire for 6 hours to fix his mistake and not forgive him. That's not weakness. That's just seeing clear. Vesnu Tal survived the battle. Barely. The hit he took in the 4th hour nearly killed him, and he carried the scar of it for the rest of his life, a deep seam across his ancient shell. He wore it, I was told, like the humans wore their service, not proudly exactly, but as a fact, a thing that had happened and mattered. The Draith who tried to disarm humanity, marked forever by a wound he took hauling human weapons to save them all. There's a justice in that too perfect for anyone to have designed. It just happened, the way the truth just happens. The station itself fought too, in its way, and I should tell you about Ro, because the quiet ones are always the ones who get forgotten. Ro was the Vathalan section chief, the being who controlled the docking rings and the bulkheads, the one I'd known to find because I'd watched the Concord for 6 months and learned who actually ran things under the ceremony. Vathalan are small, unassuming creatures, many-limbed, built for maintenance and engineering, the kind of species that keeps a station running and never gets thanked for it. Ro had never spoken in the Great Chamber, never held office. Just ran the docking rings, quietly, competently, for decades. And in the battle, Ro turned out to be as important as any soldier. Because Grace's whole defense depended on the bulkheads. Unsealing corridors at exactly the right moment, late enough to let the civilians through, early enough to stop the Sevran, time to the second, over and over, across the whole station, under fire and chaos. And that timing was Ro's. Ro sat in section control with a map of the whole station and 1,000 bulkhead controls and made the calls. This one now, that one in 10 seconds, hold this one open for the stragglers, seal that one and trap the Sevran who'd pushed through. It was its own kind of combat, fought with bulkhead controls instead of weapons, and Ro was a master of it. And Chen's 4 minutes at choke point 5 only mattered because Ro used every one of those seconds to get 3,000 people through the bulkhead before sealing it. I talked to Ro in the command position in a lull, asked how it was holding up, and Ro said in the flat, unmodulated Vathalan way, "This is the first time in 40 years anyone has needed me to do this quickly. I did not know if I still could. A pause. I can. It is good to know. I would have retired never knowing I could still do the thing I was made for. Your ambassador gave me that. Whatever else happens, she gave me one night where the thing I do mattered as much as it was ever going to matter. I will not forget it. That's the part of these stories nobody tells. It's not just the soldiers. It's the rows, the quiet, competent ones who keep everything running, who discover in the worst night of their lives that they're capable of more than a lifetime of routine ever asked of them. Grace didn't just save the station with 6 soldiers. She saved it by finding every row on the station and giving them a way to matter. That's a kind of leadership the histories never quite capture. The kind that looks at a panicking civilization and sees, in it, all the quiet, competent people who just need someone to tell them their skills are needed now. And Sithai, my old cynical Ithir colleague, 2 centuries at the Concord, Sithai did something in that battle I never expected. She translated. That sounds small, it wasn't. Because Grace's defense involved Concord volunteers, dozens of them from a dozen species, all speaking different languages, all needing to coordinate with the humans and with each other in real time under fire. And the Concord's translation systems, sophisticated as they were, weren't built for combat, weren't built for the speed and stress and life-or-death precision of a battle. A mistranslation in that chamber could get people killed. A half-second delay could lose a choke point. So Sithai and I did it by hand. The 2 translators, old and young, sitting in the command position, translating in real time between the humans and the volunteers and the station systems, fast and clean and precise. For 6 hours, our voices going ragged, our minds stretched past anything the job had ever asked. Every order Grace gave, every report that came back, every coordination between a human soldier and a Vathalan engineer and a Draith carrying ammunition. It passed through us, and we made it clean, and people lived because we made it clean. I never thought of translation as combat. It became combat that night. And Sithai, cynical, exhausted, 2-century-old Sithai, was magnificent. At one point, hours in, both of us hoarse and shaking, she caught my eye between translations and made the harmonic Ithir sound that I'd learned meant something like grim satisfaction. 200 years, she said, I have translated trade agreements. Tonight I translate a battle, tonight the words matter. She went back to it without waiting for a reply, but I saw under the exhaustion that she was more alive than I'd ever seen her. The same thing Ro felt. The same thing I think all of them felt. All the quiet, forgotten, competent ones, the terrible gift of a night when what you could do was exactly what the world needed. It's a horrible way to receive that gift. But it's a real gift, and I watched it land on person after person that night, and it changed them. The fight in the corridors lasted 6 hours. People died. Concord volunteers, mostly, the ones Grace had trained just enough to help, who caught fire meant for the humans, who fell dragging the wounded, who died in those corridors defending a home that had, hours before, been celebrating a law that made its own defenders illegal. I watched some of them die on the feeds, and I'll carry those images the rest of my life. And humans died too. Not all 6 made it. I'm going to tell you that now because I don't want you thinking this was some clean, bloodless victory where the plucky humans win without cost. 2 of the 6 died in those corridors. Petrov lived. 2 others lived, wounded. But 2 of them, 2 of the quiet, careful people who'd checked their weapons so tenderly, who'd carried the understanding so that gentler people wouldn't have to, 2 of them, gave everything they had in those corridors and did not come back out. One of them was a woman named Chen. She held choke point 5 alone for 4 minutes after her support fell, alone, wounded, against a Sevran push that had broken through everywhere else, and she held it long enough for Ro's engineers to seal the bulkhead behind the last of the fleeing civilians, and then the choke point fell, and so did she. 3,000 people made it through that bulkhead because Chen decided 4 minutes was worth her life. I never met her, really. She'd been a quiet trade specialist, I'd maybe exchanged 10 words with her in 6 months. And she died holding a corridor for aliens who'd voted, that same day, to take away her weapons. That's the part the Conquered could never quite understand afterward. Why? Why the humans died for them? Why Chen held that corridor? Why the Conquered volunteers caught fire meant for us? Why any of us fought at all for a civilization that had treated us the way they had? And the answer, the human answer, the one Grace gave when a counselor asked her, weeping, why her people had bled for those who'd wronged them. The answer was so simple it broke something in the whole chamber when she said it. Because you needed help, Grace said. That's all, that's the whole reason. You needed help and we could give it, and the fact that you'd wronged us didn't change either of those things. You don't withhold rescue to settle a score, not if you're the kind of people we're trying to be. She'd looked around at them, exhausted, bloodied, and utterly certain. You were afraid we were monsters. Monsters would have let you fall. We're not monsters. We're just people who never forgot how to fight and who chose, when it counted, to do it for you instead of to you. That's the whole difference. That was always the whole difference. You just couldn't see it until you were dying. 6 hours the fighting lasted, all told. 6 hours of the ugliest, closest, most desperate fighting I hope I never see again, most of which I watched from the command position with my hands shaking, feeding Grace what I could about the station and its systems while the humans held the line. And slowly, corridor by corridor, choke point by choke point, hour by grinding hour, the impossible thing happened. The Sevran began to break. Not to die in great numbers, the humans were too few to kill hundreds, but to break, to lose their certainty, to encounter, at every choke point, resistance they didn't understand and couldn't overcome, and slowly to realize that this harvest was different, that this station had teeth, that the submission they'd counted on for 4,000 years wasn't coming. And a predator that has never been resisted does not know how to be resisted. It has no plan for it. The Sevran had built their entire way of war on the certainty that the Conquered couldn't fight, and when that certainty failed, they had nothing underneath it. By the 5th hour they were pulling back. By the 6th, they were withdrawing to their ships. Not defeated exactly, most of them still lived, still could have kept coming, but shaken in a way that 4,000 years of easy harvests had never prepared them for, facing losses they'd never had to consider, meeting a thing they had no category for. And so they did the thing predators do when the prey turns out to have claws. They broke off. They retreated to the dark to reconsider, the way you'd back away from a meal that had started biting. The black ships pulled away from the docking rings. The boarding was over. Meridian Conquered had done the thing no Conquered station had done in 4,000 years. It had made the Sevran leave, with less than they came for. But it wasn't over. Not really. Because the Sevran weren't destroyed, they were withdrawn, regrouping, and everyone knew they'd come back, angrier and in greater force, now that they understood this station could fight. And the humans were down to 4, 2 of them wounded. And 3 hours of preparation and 6 hours of fighting had bought survival, but only survival, only this one night. The real question, the question that would decide everything, the question that turned this from a single desperate defense into the thing that changed the galaxy forever, was what came next. What the Conquered would do, now that it had seen. Now that 43 species had watched humanity stand between them and the dark and bleed and hold. And that question got answered in a way that not even Grace Halloran saw coming. But first the Sevran came back, because of course they did. And the second wave was the real test, the one that decided whether this was a fluke or a turning point. They returned at dawn. Station dawn, the artificial sun brightening along the ring's axis, about 11 hours after the first boarding, and they came angry. You could see it in how they came. The first time they'd approached like harvesters, confident, unhurried, expecting an easy night. This time they came like something that had been hurt and wanted to hurt back. More ships, a tighter formation. And they went not for the docking rings this time but for the station structure itself, because they'd learned in the first assault that boarding cost them, and now they meant to make the station pay before they ever set foot aboard. Grace had expected it, of course she had. They'll come back meaner, she'd told us, in the exhausted lull between waves. First time they were harvesting, we embarrassed them. Now it's not a harvest anymore, it's a grudge. And a predator with a grudge is more dangerous and more stupid at the same time. More dangerous because it'll spend more to win. More stupid because it stopped calculating. We use both. She'd looked around at her exhausted, diminished force, 4 humans now, 2 of them wounded plus the volunteers plus Ro and Sith and Vesnutal and me. We can't hold the way we held before. We don't have the people, so we don't hold. We do the other thing humans are good at. We make them pay so much for every meter that they decide we're not worth it. We turn ourselves into the most expensive meal they've ever tried to eat. I asked her, I couldn't help it, and if that doesn't work, if they're willing to pay. Grace looked at me, and she didn't lie to me. That's the thing I loved about her in the end. She never once lied to me, even when a lie would have been kinder. Then we lose, she said simply. Then they take the station and everyone on it, and we go down fighting, having bought as many people as much time as we could to reach the core shelters. That's the honest answer, Dara. We're not guaranteed to win. Nobody ever is. We're just guaranteed to try all the way to the end and to make it cost them everything we can make it cost. That's not victory. That's just refusing to make it easy. Sometimes that's all you've got, and sometimes it turns out to be enough. But I won't promise you it will be. I don't make promises I can't keep. Not to you, not tonight. I've thought about that answer for years. She was standing in the ruins of the first assault, 4 soldiers left, a second wave coming that was bigger and angrier than the first, and she looked a frightened kid in the eye and told him the truth. We might lose, and I won't pretend otherwise, but we're going to try all the way to the end. No false comfort, no hero speech, just the plain hard truth and the plain hard commitment to try anyway. And somehow that was braver and more steadying than any speech could have been, because I believed her. I believed we might lose, and I believed we'd try anyway. And I found, to my own surprise, that the second thing mattered more to me than the first, that I would rather be with people who'd try all the way to the end and lose than with people who'd survive by never trying at all. That's the thing the conquered had traded away, I realized standing there. Not just the weapons, the willingness to try when trying might not be enough. 4,000 years of only ever acting when victory was certain had left them unable to act when it wasn't. And humanity's whole gift, the thing under the weapons, under the training, under the organization, was the ability to try anyway. To fight the fight you might lose. To spend yourself against the dark with no guarantee, because the trying itself was the thing that made you what you were. The second assault was worse than the first. I won't pretend otherwise. They hit the station structure, exactly as Grace predicted, and sections of the outer ring lost pressure, lost power, lost gravity. The fighting, when the boarding came, was in the dark, in vacuum, in chaos, and the 4 remaining humans had to hold a longer line with fewer people against a larger, angrier force. I watched it on the feeds that survived anyway, as more and more of them went dark, and there were long stretches where I genuinely believed we were watching the end. But here's what I learned, watching humanity fight its second desperate battle in 12 hours. We get better under pressure, not worse. That's the thing the Sevran never understood, the thing 4,000 years of easy conquered harvests had never taught them. Every species they'd ever faced got worse as the pressure mounted, panicked, fragmented, broke. Humans do the opposite. Push us to the edge and something clicks over, some ancient inheritance from 200,000 years of last stands, and we get colder and clearer and more precise exactly when everything is falling apart. The worse it got, the better the 4 of them fought. Petrov, wounded now himself, held a vacuum-breached junction with a calm that bordered on serene. The 2 wounded soldiers fought from fixed positions, unable to move much, and turned that limitation into an advantage, becoming immovable anchors the whole defense pivoted around. And the volunteers, the conquered volunteers, Something happened to them in the second wave that I think mattered more than anything the humans did. They stopped being volunteers and started being soldiers. They'd watched the humans for a whole battle. They'd carried ammunition, dragged the wounded, learned the shape of it. And in the second wave, some of them picked up the weapons of the fallen and fought. Conquered citizens, species that hadn't fought in 4,000 years, whose killing instincts had supposedly been bred away, stood in those dark breached corridors and fought the Sevran alongside the humans, clumsily, terrified but fighting. Because it turned out the instinct wasn't gone. Not really. It was just buried under 4,000 years of peace, waiting. And when the humans showed them it was still there, when they saw with their own eyes that resistance was possible, that the dark could be fought, it woke up. Sith told me later that the oldest Ithir texts spoke of this, that the capacity for desperate courage never truly leaves a species, only sleeps, and can be woken by the sight of someone else refusing to submit. Humanity woke it. That was maybe the most important thing we did on Meridian Concord. Not that we fought, that we reminded 43 species they still could. The second assault broke at the height of Station Day, after 5 more hours. The Sevran, having paid more than they'd ever paid, having met not just 6 human soldiers but a whole station that had remembered how to fight, pulled back again. And this time when they pulled back, they didn't regroup for a third try. This time they left. The black ships withdrew from the system entirely, back into the dark beyond the Concord's edge, carrying their wounds and their losses and, I like to imagine, a new and unfamiliar feeling. The understanding that the conquered frontier was not the easy harvest it had been for 4,000 years. That something had changed. That there was a new thing in conquered space now, a thing that fought back and taught others to fight back, and that the age of easy taking was over. They never came back, not in my lifetime, not once in the 40 years since. Whatever they decided, out there in the dark, looking at their losses from Meridian Concord, they decided the conquered wasn't worth it anymore. And that, more than any single battle, was the victory, not driving them off for a night. Ending the 4,000-year harvest, making the dark decide to look elsewhere. Humanity did that. 40 humans, 2 of whom died, and a translator and an engineer and a disgraced counselor, and a whole station full of people who remembered, in the worst hours of their lives, that they were braver than 4,000 years of peace had let them believe. When it was over, when the last black ship vanished from the display and the all-clear finally sounded, 36 hours after the vote that started it all, there was no cheering. That struck me in the moment, and it strikes me still. When the band passed, the chamber had erupted in celebration. When the Sevran were finally driven off, the survival of 3 million people secured, the 4,000-year harvest broke in silence. Exhausted, stunned, grieving silence, because they understood now what victory actually cost. They'd celebrated the band because they thought they'd solved a problem cleanly, at no cost, with a vote. And then they'd learned what problems actually cost to solve. They'd watched people die. They'd carried the wounded and sealed the bulkheads and buried the volunteers. Real victory doesn't feel like the celebration after a vote. Real victory feels like this, like being too tired and too sad and too changed to cheer, like standing in the wreckage counting who's still alive and grieving who isn't. Grace Halloran stood in the command position, gray and exhausted, having not slept in a day and a half, having lost 2 of her people, having saved 3 million who'd tried to disarm her. And she didn't celebrate either. She just stood there, very still. The banked fire burned almost all the way down now, and she looked at the all-clear on the display for a long moment. And then she said, quietly, mostly to herself, the thing I've never forgotten. I hope they remember this right, that's all, not that we won, that it cost. If they remember it as humans saved us, they've learned nothing. If they remember it as this is what it costs to have forgotten how to protect ourselves, then maybe the ones who died bought something worth the price. She rubbed her eyes. Get me the speaker, Dara, and Vesnutal if he's still alive. It's not over. The fighting's over. But the part that actually matters, that's just starting. Now we find out what they learned. I went to get them. And what happened in the great chamber over the days that followed, what the conquered decided, what humanity became to them, and the thing Grace Halloran said that changed 43 star nations forever, that's the last part of the story. Let me tell you how it ended, or really how it began. The conquered met 3 days after the last black ship vanished. Not in emergency session this time. In full formal session, the whole great chamber, all 43 species, every delegate who'd survived, gathered under the artificial sun to decide what the last 36 hours had meant and what would come of them. I was there. Grace insisted I be there, in the chamber this time, not up in the translation booth. You earned the floor, she told me. You were in it from the first minute to the last. You sit where I can see you. So I sat on the chamber floor, among the delegates, a contract translator who'd become something I didn't have a word for, and I watched the Concord of Star Nations reckon with itself. It was quieter than I'd ever seen it. The panic was gone, and so was the pride, the old easy pride of 11,000 years, the pride that had passed the ban at 1422 to applause. That was gone, burned out of them. What was left was something I hadn't seen in that chamber before. Humility. Real humility, the hard kind, the kind you only get by being shown, undeniably, that you were wrong about something that mattered enormously. The speaker opened the session. The silver ether, her canyon wind voice subdued now, and she said something that I think took real courage for a being whose whole life was the ceremony of that place. 3 days ago, she said, this conquered declared human weapons unlawful. We did so believing we were protecting our peace from a dangerous new species. We were wrong, not partly wrong, wrong in the whole substance of the thing. The species we tried to disarm is the reason 3 million of us are alive to hold this session. The weapons we called savage are the reason the Sevran have withdrawn for the first time in 4,000 years. And 2 of the people we voted to disarm are dead, having spent their lives defending us from an enemy we forbade them to fight. She paused. We built 11,000 years of law on the principle that we could recognize our errors and correct them. Let us prove that principle is not yet dead. Let us begin by hearing from the humans we wronged. Ambassador Halloran, the conquered recognizes you. And the conquered, her voice caught just slightly, the conquered apologizes. Before you speak, so that whatever you say it to a body that has already admitted what it did. And Grace Halloran rose and walked to the center of the great chamber, to the same speaking position where she'd stood 36 hours earlier, and offered them their only chance. She looked exhausted still. 3 days hadn't been enough to sleep it off. You don't sleep off a thing like that in 3 days, but the banked fire was back, turned low and steady. And she stood there in the quiet chamber and she did not gloat. That's the thing I want you to understand about what she said. She had every right to gloat. She'd been proven right in the most complete and costly way imaginable. She'd warned them, they'd refused her, they'd disarmed her, and then they'd nearly died and begged for her help and watched her people bleed to save them. If ever a person had earned the right to stand up and say, "I told you so," it was Grace Halloran in that chamber. She didn't. She did something much harder and much more human and much more important. She let them off the hook. "I'm not going to tell you that you were wrong," Grace began. "You already know it. The speaker just said it. You don't need me to say it again, and I'm not interested in making you feel it more than you already do. That's not why I'm standing here." The chamber was silent. "I want to tell you why you were wrong," she said. "Because that matters more than the fact of it. If you just learn humans were right and we were wrong, you've learned nothing useful. You'll spend the next 1,000 years afraid of us in a new way, grateful, dependent, but still not understanding. So let me tell you the actual thing, the thing under the weapons." She looked around at all of them slowly. "You didn't ban our weapons because they were dangerous," she said. "You banned them because they frightened you. And they frightened you because they reminded you of something you'd spent 4,000 years trying to forget, that the universe is not safe. That peace is not permanent, that there are things in the dark that want to take from you, and that no amount of law or ceremony or civilization makes you safe from them forever. Our weapons are ugly because they're honest. Every brutal practical line of them says the same thing. Someday you will be cornered, and on that day, this is what will be between you and the end. You didn't want to hear that. You'd built 11,000 years of beauty specifically so you'd never have to hear it. And then we walked in carrying the ugly truth in our hands, and you tried to make the truth illegal. She paused. You can't, that's the whole lesson. You can ban the weapon. You cannot ban the day it was built for. The day comes whether you're ready or not. All the ban did was make sure you'd face it unready. I watched Vesnu Tal as she said it. He was there in the chamber, the deep scar across his shell from the ammunition run in the 4th hour. And he was nodding slowly, the slow, deliberate Draith nod, taking the words like medicine he knew he needed. But here's the other half, Grace said, and her voice softened. And this is the part I actually came here to say, so listen. You were wrong to fear us, but you were not wrong that we're dangerous. We are. Everything you were afraid of is true. We are a species that knows how to fight, that has never forgotten, that carries 200,000 years of violence in our bones. All of that is real. You just drew exactly the wrong conclusion from it. She looked around the chamber. You thought, they're dangerous, so we must control them, disarm them, make them safe. Wrong conclusion. The right conclusion, the one you'll spend the next 1,000 years learning, is this. We're dangerous, and we chose to point it at the dark instead of at you. That's the thing that should actually amaze you. Not that we're capable of violence. That we're capable of it and we didn't use it on you, not even after you wronged us. That we spent it defending you instead. A dangerous thing that chooses to protect you is not something to fear. It's the most valuable ally you will ever have. And you almost threw it away because you couldn't get past how ugly it looked. She let that settle. And then she said the thing that I've seen quoted in 100 places since. The thing that became, in a sense, the founding line of everything that came after. We were never the threat to your peace, Grace Halloran said. We were the only thing that could keep it. A peace that can't defend itself isn't peace. It's just a delay. It's just submission that hasn't been collected yet. You had a beautiful delay and you called it peace for 4,000 years, and the bill came due this week, the way it always eventually does. We didn't break your peace. We showed you it was never finished. Peace isn't the absence of the capacity for violence. Peace is the capacity for violence, held by people who have decided not to use it and ready, always ready, for the day something else decides to use it on them. You forgot the second half. We're here to help you remember, not to rule you, not to frighten you, to stand in the dark at the edge of your beautiful civilization and make sure it gets to keep being beautiful, if you'll let us. That's the offer. It always was. The Concord accepted the offer. Of course they did. But the way they accepted it mattered, and I want to tell you about it, because it's the part that turned a battle into a genuine turning point for the whole galaxy. They didn't just repeal the ban. That would have been the small thing, the obvious thing. They did something much larger. Over the weeks and months that followed, I stayed for all of it. My contract, long since irrelevant, kept on because I'd become one of the few beings who could move fluidly between human and conquered worlds. The Conquered restructured its entire relationship with the reality of violence. They created something new, a defense corps, the first genuine military the Conquered had fielded in 4,000 years, built on human doctrine but staffed by all species. Humans taught it, not because we ruled it, but because we were the only ones who remembered how. And the strangest, most moving thing happened as they built it. The Conquered species discovered they weren't as far from their fighting past as they'd believed. The instinct woke, the way it had woken in the volunteers during the second assault. Species that had told themselves for 4,000 years that they'd evolved past violence found when they actually tried, that they hadn't, that the capacity was still there, sleeping, and that waking it didn't make them savages. It made them whole. It gave them back a piece of themselves they'd amputated and called it growth. Vesnu Tal championed the new core. That surprised everyone. The architect of the ban, the loudest voice against human violence, became the loudest voice for the conquered relearning how to defend itself. He spent the rest of his long life on it, the disgraced counselor, redeemed not by being forgiven but by doing the work, by spending his final decades building the thing he'd once tried to prevent. He used to say, I heard him say it, more than once, that he'd been given a rare gift. The chance to see his own worst error clearly, in time to spend his life correcting it. Most beings, he'd say, in that slow, deep voice, die still believing their mistakes were wisdom. I was shown mine, undeniably, with 36 hours and 3 million lives as the proof. That is not a punishment. That is a mercy. I get to spend what's left of me making it right. The scar on his shell he never had removed. He wore it to every session of the new Defense Council until the day he died, a permanent reminder, carved into him, of the night the ugly truth came calling. I should tell you what happened to the others. It's only right. Petrov, big quiet Petrov, who told me the ones who love it wash out, he lived. Recovered from his wounds mostly. And he became one of the first instructors of the new conquered Defense Corps, teaching aliens to fight, and he turned out to be extraordinary at it, precisely because he hated war so much. He taught it the way he described it to me that first day, checking his rifle. As a terrible thing you master so that gentler people don't have to, carried with care, deployed with reluctance, understood completely. His students, Ithir and Draith and Vathalan and a dozen other species, adored him. He taught for 20 years. Thousands of conquered defenders learned the craft from a man who spent every lesson reminding them he hoped they'd never need it. That's the right person to teach war. The ones who love it wash out. The ones who understand it should be the ones who pass it on. I asked Petrov once, years into his teaching, whether it bothered him, spending his life teaching violence to species that had been peaceful for 4,000 years. Whether he ever worried he was breaking something, taking away the very innocence that had made the conquered beautiful. He thought about it a long time. He was like that. He never gave you the fast answer. I used to worry about that, he said finally. First few years it kept me up. Was I ruining them, turning gentle people into killers? And then I figured something out. He looked at me. I wasn't teaching them to be violent. The violence was already in them. It's in everything that evolved, everything that ever had to survive. All I was teaching them was how to control it, how to carry it without it carrying you, how to point it at the right thing at the right time and put it down after. That's not breaking their innocence, Dara. That's the opposite. An innocent who can't defend himself isn't innocent. He's just prey that hasn't been caught yet. Real innocence, the kind worth having, is knowing exactly what you're capable of and choosing gentleness anyway and being able to make that choice stick when something comes for the people you love. He shook his head. The conquered wasn't innocent before we came. It was just defenseless and calling it innocence. There's a difference. I spent 20 years teaching them the difference. I sleep fine. I've never heard the thing said better. An innocent who can't defend himself is just prey that hasn't been caught yet. That was the whole error of the conquered, distilled. They'd confused defenselessness with virtue, mistaken their inability to fight for a decision not to. And Petrov spent 20 years teaching them the difference, gently, patiently, hoping the whole time they'd never need the lesson, knowing they would. Ro, the quiet Vathalan engineer, the master of the bulkheads, got the recognition it never sought. The conquered, in rebuilding, understood at last how much its survival had depended on the quiet, competent ones, and Ro became something of a legend among the station engineers, the one who'd fought a battle with bulkhead controls and won. Ro didn't retire after all. Kept running the docking rings for another 15 years, but differently now, training others, passing on the knowledge, making sure that the next time the dark came, there'd be 100 beings who could do what Ro had done. I visited Ro years later. Asked if it had been worth it, all of it, the terror of that night, and Ro gave the flat Vathalan answer I should have expected. I discovered what I was for, it said. Most beings never do. I would not trade that for an easier night. Sithai, my old cynical Ithir colleague, 2 centuries at the Concord, she and I stayed friends for the rest of her life. The battle changed her, burned the cynicism out of her, or maybe just showed her what the cynicism had been protecting. She'd spent 200 years translating trade agreements and believing underneath that nothing much mattered, that it was all ceremony and delay. And then she translated a battle and watched the words matter, watched people live because she made them clean. She never went back to the cynicism after that. She translated for the new Defense Corps in the end, put her 2 centuries of skill to work in the service of the thing that had woken her up. You gave an old creature a reason, she told me once, echoing Roe without knowing it. I was ready to be done. 200 years and I was ready to simply stop. And then your people arrived and reminded me that the words can matter, that the work can matter, that even at the very end there might be one more night when what you can do is exactly what the world needs. She made the harmonic sound, the grim satisfaction one that I'd come to love. I am not done anymore. Thank you for that. Thank you for being an ugly, violent, impossible species that refused to let us fall. There's a thing people always want to know when I tell this, and I've never been sure how to answer it cleanly, so I'll just tell you what I saw. They want to know about the regret. The title the histories gave it, that every star nation regretted the ban within hours. People hear that and they picture something dramatic. A single moment of collective shame, 43 species bowing their heads at once. It wasn't like that. Regret in a real civilization is quieter and stranger than that, and it took different shapes in different species. And watching it move through the Concord over those months was one of the strangest things I ever witnessed. Some of them regretted it the honest way, the Vesnu Tao way, by standing up and saying plainly that they'd been wrong and setting about the work of fixing it. Those were the ones I came to trust. But others regretted it the other way, the way frightened people often do, by pretending they'd never really supported it. I watched delegates who had stood and spoken passionately for the ban, who had called human weapons obscene, who had wept actual tears about the moral stain of our existence. I watched those same delegates, weeks later, claim they'd always had private doubts, that they'd voted for it reluctantly, that they'd sensed, somehow, that it was premature. It was a lie, and everyone in the chamber knew it was a lie, and nobody called it out, because the Concord in those months was too busy surviving to spend energy on who'd been wrong and how loudly. Grace found it darkly funny. Watch, she told me once in the back of a session. In 50 years none of them will admit they voted for the ban. There'll be 43 species, and not one of them will have been in favor. Defeat is an orphan. That vote will be the most parentless decision in galactic history. She was right, more or less. The histories smoothed it into the Concord deciding, the Concord erring, the Concord learning, a single actor with a single regret, which is much more comfortable than the truth, which is that a great many specific individuals made a specific choice and then scrambled afterward to unremember having made it. That's the part the grand title misses, and I want you to have it, because it's the truest thing I know about how civilizations handle their worst mistakes. The regret was real, but regret isn't the same as reckoning. Regret is what you feel. Reckoning is what you do about what you feel, and most of the Concord felt the regret sincerely while doing everything possible to avoid the reckoning, to smooth it over, to fold it into an abstract institutional lesson that didn't require any particular person to say I was the one. I did this. It was my hand on the vote. The ones who managed the reckoning, Vesnu Tao, a handful of others, were rare, and they were the ones who actually changed the galaxy. The rest just regretted comfortably in the passive voice and let the ones with real spines do the building. I've seen the same thing in every institution I've been part of since. Regret is common and cheap. Reckoning is rare and expensive, and it's the only one that's worth anything. I went to see Chen's family, years later. It's the hardest thing I did in the whole aftermath, and the most important, and I almost didn't do it, and I'm so glad I did. Chen, the woman who held chokepoint 5 for 4 minutes, alone, wounded so that 3,000 people could get through a bulkhead. Chen had a family back in human space. A partner. 2 children young when she died. I'd never met them. I'd barely known Chen. But I'd watched her die on the feed and I'd carried it for years. And when I finally traveled back to human space on Concord business, I found them and I went to their door because it seemed to me that someone who'd been there ought to. Her partner opened the door. An ordinary man, older now, grief worn into him the way grief wears into people who have lived with it a long time. And I told him who I was, that I'd been on Meridian Concord, that I'd been in the command position when it happened, that I'd seen what Chen did. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked me the question I'd been dreading, the question I'd crossed light years half hoping he wouldn't ask. Was it worth it? And I understood, standing on that doorstep, that he didn't mean the battle. He didn't mean the Concord or the Sevran or the grand strategic turning point the histories talked about. He meant, was my partner's life worth what it bought? Were the 3,000 strangers who got through that bulkhead worth the mother his children grew up without? Was the trade a fair one? And he was asking me because I'd been there, because I'd seen it, because I was maybe the only person who could give him an answer that wasn't just words. I thought about lying, about giving him the easy grand answer, the she died a hero answer, the her sacrifice changed the galaxy answer. All of it true, technically. All of it useless to a man on a doorstep who'd lost the person he loved. So I told him the truth instead, the Grace Halloran truth, the kind you don't dress up. I don't know if it was worth it, I said. I don't think that's a question that has an answer, honestly. 3,000 people got through that bulkhead because of her. Those 3,000 had families too, partners, children, people who'd have grieved them the way you grieve her. So it's not 3,000 strangers against your one Chen. It's 3,000 griefs like yours that didn't happen because she made one grief like yours happen instead. I can't tell you that math comes out clean. It doesn't. Grief isn't math. But I can tell you what she did exactly and you can decide for yourself what it was worth because you knew her and I didn't, and that's your right, not mine. And then I told him every detail I had, the 4 minutes, the wounded stand, the bulkhead ceiling behind the last of the 3,000, all of it plain the way it happened. He listened to all of it, and when I was done he was crying quietly the way people cry who have been crying for years. And he said, that's who she was, before any of it. That's exactly who she was. She'd have done it for 3,000 or for 3. She never could stand to let people fall. He wiped his face. It wasn't worth it. I'll never think it was worth it. I'd trade all 3,000 of them to have her back, and I'm not ashamed of that, and she'd understand it and forgive me for it. He looked at me. But she wouldn't have made a different choice. Even knowing what it'd cost us. That's the terrible thing. It wasn't worth it, and she'd do it again, and both of those are true, and I have to live in the space between them for the rest of my life. A long breath. Thank you for coming. Thank you for telling me true. Everyone else gave me the hero speech. You're the first one who told me it wasn't worth it. Somehow that's the only thing that's helped. I've thought about that for the rest of my life. It wasn't worth it, and she'd do it again, and both of those are true. That's what these stories actually cost underneath the grand telling, not clean heroic sacrifice. A man on a doorstep living in the space between it wasn't worth it, and she'd do it again for the rest of his life. The histories don't have room for that man, but he's the truest part of the whole thing. Him and the space he lives in. Never let anyone tell you these victories are clean. They're bought on doorsteps like that one, in griefs like his. And the buying never stops just because the battle did. And Grace Halloran. Grace became the first human ambassador to the reformed Concord, not provisional anymore, not a supplicant at the door, but a full member, an honored one. The woman who'd saved 3 million lives and then, harder, taught the Concord what the saving had meant. She served for a long time. She was good at it, the way she was good at everything. With that banked fire stillness that the Concord had once mistaken for weakness and now understood finally for what it was. She never gloated, not once in all the years after, when beings thanked her, and they did constantly for the rest of her life. She deflected it always to the two who died. To Chen, who held choke point 5 for 4 minutes. To the other soldier whose name I've kept out of this telling at his family's request. Grace made sure that every honor that came her way got redirected to them, to the ones who'd paid the actual price. I gave orders, she'd say. They gave everything. Thank them, not me. And she meant it. She spent the rest of her life making sure the Concord remembered that its salvation had cost human lives, that the ugly truth she'd spoken in the chamber had been paid for in the most expensive currency there is. She and I stayed close. She'd pulled a frightened translator into the fire and taken responsibility for me, and she never set that down. She became something between a commander and a mother and a friend to me over the years. I owe her most of who I became. When she finally retired, very old, the banked fire finally allowed to go out, I was there. And when she died, some years after, I gave one of the eulogies, in that same great chamber, to 43 species who'd come to mourn the human who'd saved them all. I asked her once, near the end, when she was very old and we were sitting quietly together the way you do with someone you've known forever, whether she'd ever been afraid. During the 36 hours, whether the calm I'd watched her hold had been real, or a performance she'd put on for the rest of us. She was quiet for a while, then she said, it was real and it was a performance, both. That's the secret nobody tells you about command. She looked at her old hands. I was terrified the entire time, Dara, every minute of it. I was as scared as you were, as scared as anyone. The difference wasn't that I didn't feel the fear. The difference was that I'd decided a long time ago that my fear wasn't allowed to be everyone's problem. When you're in command, your fear is contagious. If you show it, it spreads and people die of it. So you hold it. You feel every bit of it and you hold it inside and you show the people around you calm instead, because calm is contagious too and calm keeps people alive. That's not fearlessness. Fearlessness is a myth or a mental illness. It's just deciding to carry your fear privately so that your people can borrow your steadiness instead of catching your panic. Anyone can learn it. Most people never have to. I had to young and it never left me. She smiled faintly. The calm was real. I really was calm on the outside on purpose as a gift to all of you. And underneath it I was screaming the whole time, same as everyone. Both true. That's command. That's the whole job, really. Feeling the fear and giving people the calm anyway. I've carried that too. Feeling the fear and giving people the calm anyway. It's the best description of leadership I've ever heard, and she said it as an old woman in a quiet room, not as a grand pronouncement, just the plain truth of a thing she'd done for a living for 50 years. The Concord had mistaken her calm for weakness once. It had been the exact opposite. It had been the hardest strength there is, the strength to be terrified and useful at the same time, to carry your own fear, so that 3 million other people didn't have to carry theirs. And I should tell you about Vesnu Tao, because his is the part of this that I've thought about most in the long years since. He was the one who built the ban. The Draith counselor, old even by the standards of a species that lives a long time, the great philosopher who'd spent 300 years arguing that a truly civilized people put away the tools of killing, that weapons built for the worst day were a kind of moral surrender, a refusal to believe in the better world. He'd meant it. That's the thing I need you to understand. He wasn't a coward or a fool. He was a good being who believed a beautiful thing so hard that he couldn't see the ugly truth standing right next to it. He'd looked at humanity and seen everything he'd spent his life arguing against, and he'd moved to make us illegal, and 43 star nations had followed him because he was wise and old and they trusted him. And then the Sevran came, and Vesnu Tao, who had never in 300 years touched a weapon, who had built his entire life around the conviction that the civilized do not fight. Vesnu Tao spent the worst hours of the battle hauling ammunition through the fire. I saw him do it. That's not a story I got secondhand. I watched a being older than my grandmother's grandmother, slow and heavy and utterly unsuited to it, drag crates of the very ordnance he'd voted to outlaw down a burning corridor to the humans who needed it, because there was no one else to do it and it needed doing. A piece of falling structure took a gouge out of his shell that he carried to his grave, a long pale scar across the dark dome of him, the mark of the day the philosopher learned the thing his philosophy had missed. He never had it repaired. He could have. He chose to keep it. He said later that he'd earned it honestly and it would be a lie to smooth it away. After, when it was over, when the Concord was rebuilding itself into something that could survive, Vesnutal did the hardest thing I've ever watched a public figure do. He stood in that great chamber in front of the 43 species who trusted his wisdom, and he said he had been wrong. Not partly wrong. Not wrong in hindsight, the coward's version. Wrong at the root, about the thing he'd staked his whole life on. He said he had confused peace with the appearance of peace. He said he had loved the beautiful idea so much that he'd been willing to make the ugly truth illegal rather than look at it, and that this had nearly killed them all, and that the scar on his shell was the least of what his error had cost, that the real cost was measured in the 2 graves the humans were digging. And then he did something rarer still. He didn't resign and disappear into disgraced retirement, which would have been easier, which would have been its own kind of running. He stayed. He took the hardest job left. He became the loudest voice in the Concord for building the very thing he'd spent 3 centuries arguing against, a real defense, an honest one, staffed by every species, taught by humans. The architect of the band became the architect of the shield. He spent the last decades of his long life making sure the Concord would never again be as helpless as his own wisdom had once made it. I think that took more courage than the corridor did. Anyone can be brave when the alarms are screaming. It's a rarer thing to stand in front of everyone who ever admired you and say the thing I taught you was wrong, and here is what it cost, and here is what I will spend the rest of my life doing to repair it. We built a memorial in the end. Small, that was deliberate. Grace insisted on small. The Concord's instinct, once it understood what it owed, was to build something enormous, some vast gleaming monument the scale of the fortress in that other story people tell, and Grace put her foot down. She said the size of a memorial is inversely proportional to how much the builders actually remember. She said the honest ones are small, so it's small. A quiet room off one of the great concourses, easy to miss if you don't know it's there. 2 names on the wall, Chen's and the one I've kept private. A single line beneath them in the languages of all 43 nations that Grace chose herself. It doesn't say they died for peace. It doesn't say they died for the Concord. It says they were ready so that you would not have to be. That's all. I've stood in that room more times than I can count, an old man now, reading those 7 words in 100 scripts, and I've never once gotten through it dry-eyed. I told them what she'd told me in the lull before the second wave, when I asked her what would happen if the defense didn't work. I told them she'd looked a frightened kid in the eye and refused to lie to him. We might lose, and I won't pretend otherwise, but we're going to try all the way to the end. I told them that was the truest thing about her, and about humanity, and about what she taught the Concord. Not that we win, but that we try, all the way to the end, whether or not we're guaranteed to win. And that the trying itself is the thing. The trying is what she gave them. The trying is what they'd forgotten, and she helped them remember. The chamber was silent when I finished. And then from the delegates rose a sound I'd never heard in that place, 43 species, each in its own way, making the sound of grief and gratitude at once. 43 ways of saying goodbye to a small gray-haired human who'd walked onto their chamber floor when everything was ending, and simply, quietly begun. I'm an old man now, telling you this 40 years later. I stayed with the Concord my whole life in the end. The frightened contract translator became a bridge between 2 civilizations and spent 40 years being that bridge, and I don't regret a day of it. I watched the Concord transform, watched it become, slowly, something better than the beautiful brittle thing I'd first encountered. It kept its peace, but it stopped being a delay. It became a peace that could defend itself, that had remembered the second half of what peace actually means, and it was stronger and truer for it. The Sevran never came back. Other threats did over the years, as threats always do, And the Concord met them now with the thing it had relearned, with human doctrine and its own woken courage, and it held. It held. A few years ago I was asked to speak to a class. Young ones, mixed, the way everything in the Concord is mixed now. A room full of children from a dozen species, human and Ithir and Draith and Vathalan and others, all of them born long after the 36 hours, to whom the whole thing was just history, a story from their grandparents' time. Their teacher wanted me to tell them about the battle, about Meridian Concord and the Sevran and the day human weapons were briefly illegal, and I did. I told it to them the way I've told it to you, more or less, a little simpler, a little gentler in the hard parts because they were young. And when I was done, a small Draith child, slow and serious the way Draith are even when young, raised one heavy limb. "Why did the grown-ups vote to take the weapons away?" she asked. "If the weapons were the thing that saved everyone, why did they vote to lose them?" And I understood that this was the whole question, the one the entire story exists to answer. Why do intelligent, good-hearted people, over and over, vote to disarm themselves against the dark? Why did the Concord do it? Why do civilizations keep doing it, in one form or another, across every species that ever built one? I thought about how to say it to a child. Because the weapons were ugly, I said, and they were frightening, and they reminded everyone of a scary thing they didn't want to think about, that the world isn't always safe, that someday something bad might come, that we might have to fight to protect the people we love. I looked around at all those young faces, and when something reminds us of a scary thing we don't want to think about, sometimes we get angry at the reminder instead of the scary thing. It's easier. The scary thing is far away and hard to fight, but the reminder is right there. So people voted to get rid of the reminder, the ugly weapons, because it felt like getting rid of the fear. It wasn't. The scary thing was still coming. They'd just gotten rid of the thing that could have stopped it. But it felt better for 25 minutes to not have to look at the ugly reminder anymore. The Draith child considered this with tremendous seriousness. And then she asked the second question, the one that told me she'd actually understood. "So we shouldn't get rid of scary reminders, even when we want to?" "That's right," I said. "That's exactly right. When something frightens you because it reminds you of a hard truth, that's usually the thing you need to keep. The fear is telling you it's important. The trick is to learn to tell the difference between a thing that's scary because it's dangerous to you, and a thing that's scary because it's telling you something true that you don't want to hear. The first kind, you're right to fear. The second kind you keep close, even though it frightens you, precisely because it frightens you. Because the day will come when you need it, and it won't announce itself in advance, and you'll be so glad you didn't vote it away when you had the chance." The whole class was quiet, taking it in. And then a human child in the back, small, maybe 7, said something that undid me right there in front of everyone. "My grandpa was there," she said. "At the battle. He told me about it before he died. He said the aliens were scared of us, and then we saved them, and then they weren't scared anymore. He said it was the proudest thing he ever did." She looked at me. "Did you know my grandpa? His name was Petrov." And I had to stop for a moment, because I had known her grandpa. Big quiet Petrov, who checked his rifle so tenderly, who taught war for 20 years hoping his students would never need it, who told me an innocent who can't defend himself is just prey that hasn't been caught yet. And here was his granddaughter, in a mixed classroom in a Concord that had learned the lesson, telling me it was the proudest thing he ever did. "I knew your grandpa," I told her, and my voice wasn't quite steady. "He was one of the bravest people I ever met, and one of the gentlest. Those two things go together more than people think. He'd be very proud of you for asking good questions in a room full of every kind of person, in a galaxy that learned how to keep itself safe. That's what he fought for. Rooms exactly like this one. You're the thing he was protecting. You and this and all of it." She smiled, satisfied, the way children do when they've connected themselves to something larger. And I stood in that classroom, an old man among the children of a dozen species, and I understood that this was the actual victory. Not the battle, not the Sevran withdrawing. This, a mixed classroom, safe, asking good questions, in a Concord that had learned to defend itself without losing itself. Petrov's granddaughter and the serious Draith child, and all of them, growing up in the peace that could finally protect itself. That's what it was all for. That's what Chen's 4 minutes bought, and what the two who fell gave their lives for, and what the ugly weapons were always about. Not violence. This, a room full of safe children, learning to tell the difference between the fears you should heed and the fears you should master. I'd tell it to those children 1,000 times, if it would keep even one room like that one safe. People ask me sometimes what the lesson was. They want it small enough to carry, and I understand the wish, so I try. The lesson isn't that violence is good. It isn't. 2 people died in those corridors, and I've never once thought their deaths were good. The lesson isn't even that you should keep your weapons, though you should. The lesson is about the ugly truth, and what happens when you try to make it illegal. The Concord looked at humanity and saw the ugly truth, that the universe isn't safe, that peace isn't permanent, that someday you'll be cornered and need the tool built for the worst day. And instead of facing the truth, they tried to ban it, to vote it away, to make the thing that frightened them unlawful so they wouldn't have to look at it. And the universe answered that vote within 25 minutes because the universe does not care what you make illegal. The dark comes whether you've outlawed the defense against it or not. You cannot legislate away the parts of reality you find frightening. You can only decide whether you'll face them ready or unready. That's the whole of it. That's what 43 star nations learned in 36 hours, at the cost of 2 human lives and a great deal of blood. The ugly truth doesn't become less true because you've made it illegal to hold. It just waits patiently for the day you need it, and laughs, if the dark can laugh, at the civilization that outlawed its own survival because survival wasn't beautiful enough. They declared human weapons illegal, and hours later, minutes later, really, every star nation regretted it, not because the weapons were sacred, because the weapons were honest. And you can't survive very long, it turns out, by making honesty against the law. I go back to Meridian Concord still when I can. It's very old now, even by its own standards, and very changed, and there's a memorial in the great chamber to the ones who died in the 36 hours Chen and the other soldier and the Concord volunteers who caught fire meant for the humans. It's a simple thing, the memorial. The Concord wanted something grand, and Grace, while she lived, refused to let them build it. Make it small, she'd insisted. Make it honest. They didn't die for grandeur. They died so people could get through a bulkhead. Make it the size of what they actually did. So it's small. A quiet marker in a corner of the vast chamber, easy to miss. I stood in front of it last time I went. An old human, alone, in the chamber where it all happened. And I thought about the vote at 1422, and the alarm at 1429, and the 25 minutes the ban on human weapons actually lasted. I thought about Petrov checking his rifle so tenderly, and Vesnu Tal hauling ammunition through fire, and Rowe at the bulkheads, and Sithai translating a battle, and Chen's 4 minutes, and Grace Halloran walking onto that chamber floor when everything was ending, and simply, quietly beginning. And I thought they were so afraid of us, for so long. They looked at the ugly truth in our hands and they were so afraid. And in the end, the ugly truth was the only thing that loved them enough to stand in the dark and refuse to let them fall. That's what our weapons were always for. That's what we were always for. Not to frighten the beautiful, peaceful, frightened peoples of the galaxy. To stand between them and the dark, so they could go on being beautiful. They just had to almost lose everything to see it. Most people do. That's the whole story. I was there for all of it. And now you know it too, which means now it's yours to carry and to tell, so that the next civilization that gets frightened of the ugly truth might remember, before the vote, what happened to the Concord of Star Nations the day they declared human weapons illegal. 25 minutes. That's how long you get sometimes, between making the truth illegal and needing it most. Don't waste yours voting against the dark. Spend it getting ready.